Welcome back, esteemed readers. Today, our focus sharpens on an epical juncture in global annals, the American Revolution. Should you be prepared for an exhaustive odyssey through the labyrinthine complexities of colonial discontents, the contentious realm of fiscal levies, and the very genesis of an independent nation, then your presence here is indeed most apposite. The narrative of the American Revolution does not, in fact, commence in the year 1775, with the reverberating shot heard round the world. On the contrary, this sprawling chronicle of colonial insurgency finds its antecedents extending many decades prior, during an era when the nexus between Great Britain and its American colonies remained comparatively amicable, akin to a profoundly dysfunctional familial unit that had yet to fully grasp the extent of its own internal discord. Envision the formidable British Empire in the nascent years of the 18th century as that overly confident progenitor who presumes an inherent understanding of what constitutes the optimal course for all concerned. This imperial power had recently concluded a series of exceedingly costly military engagements, notably including the French and Indian War, which spanned the years from 1754 to 1763. This protracted conflict essentially manifested as an exorbitantly priced contest over territorial dominion in North America between the rival powers of Britain and France, with various indigenous Native American tribes judiciously aligning themselves with one faction or another, much like selecting sides for an exceptionally perilous game of kickball. The French and Indian War, alternatively recognized as the 7 Years' War, fundamentally encapsulated Britain's resolute declaration: "We harbor a profound aversion to France possessing any advantageous assets in North America." The hostilities unfolded across a multitude of continents, yet the American theater proved particularly savage and financially draining. British armed forces, augmented by colonial militias, engaged in fierce combat against French contingents and their Native American confederates across the untamed frontier territories of what would eventually constitute the United States. This conflict was punctuated by such memorable episodes as a nascent George Washington experiencing his initial foray into military command, only to find himself expeditiously encircled at Fort Necessity, an endeavor whose success was precisely as underwhelming as its name might suggest. Ultimately, the British emerged victorious, thereby securing suzerainty over the preponderance of French North America. However, this triumph was exacted at a financial burden that would undoubtedly elicit profound satisfaction from any contemporary defense contractor. The war had inflicted upon Britain an utterly staggering pecuniary toll, approximately commensurate with several $billion in present-day currency. It is at this juncture that events acquire an intriguing, almost presciently ominous character, hinting at an imminent calamitous denouement. Britain, confronted with its colossal war debt, then cast its gaze upon its American colonies, which had undeniably reaped the benefits of British protection throughout the conflict, and consequently concluded, "Surely these appreciative colonists will not object to contributing towards the expenses of their own defense." This line of reasoning appears superficially sound until one recalls that the colonists had been exercising a considerable degree of self-governance for over a century, thereby cultivating a decidedly independent disposition, much like adolescents who suddenly discover their parents expect them to commence paying rent. The inaugural significant endeavor to extract fiscal contributions from the colonies materialized in the guise of the Sugar Act of 1764. which in reality constituted a revision of an antecedent molasses tax that had been so pervasively disregarded, it might as well have been a mere suggestion. The Sugar Act diminished the levy on molasses but, crucially, enforced its collection with unprecedented rigor, an action akin to parental figures finally choosing to implement a curfew after years of lax enforcement. Furthermore, the act expanded the purview of admiralty courts, tribunals that adjudicated cases without the benefit of juries, presumably because the British government perceived the abrogation of the right to trial by jury as an optimal strategy for cultivating colonial goodwill. Colonial merchants, particularly those whose commercial paradigms were heavily reliant upon what might charitably be termed creative interpretations of extant trade statutes, were decidedly unamused. Nevertheless, the Sugar Act merely served as a prelude to the principal engagement, the Stamp Act of 1765. This legislative instrument mandated that all paper commodities bear a distinctive stamp procured from British functionaries, thereby transmuting every colonial legal practitioner, journalistic publisher, and card enthusiast into an unwitting tax collector. And when referring to paper commodities, it encompasses virtually every item involving paper: newspapers, legal instruments, playing cards, dice, and even academic diplomas. The underlying implication was that the British government sought to ensure that even the pursuit of education incurred a substantial financial outlay. This policy was analogous to a hypothetical contemporary governmental decree requiring a special governmental sticker for every text message transmitted, yet somehow possessing an even greater capacity for vexation. The colonial rejoinder to the Stamp Act was both immediate and as subtly expressed as a projectile brick shattering a window. It is pertinent to underscore, however, that this reaction did not, at this juncture, necessarily represent a clarion call for outright independence. A considerable number of colonists would have readily assented to taxation had they possessed genuine representation within Parliament. The fundamental quandary arose from the British government's response to this entirely reasonable demand, which essentially amounted to, "You are virtually represented," a retort as gastronomically unfulfilling as being informed of virtual sustenance whilst experiencing actual starvation. Virtual representation posited the notion that members of Parliament embodied the interests of all British subjects, transcending the specific concerns of their immediate constituents, a theoretical construct that, in practical application, yielded results precisely as ineffective as one might anticipate. The opposition to the Stamp Act manifested in a myriad of forms, ranging from formal petitions and organized boycotts to more direct actions that would render modern-day protesters appear remarkably circumspect. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine fraternity, whose secrecy was roughly equivalent to that of a marching band, orchestrated resistance throughout the various colonies. Their modus operandi specialized in what might be characterized as aggressive persuasion, routinely hanging effigies of stamp distributors, systematically ransacking their residences, and generally conveying an unequivocal message that the collection of stamp taxes was not a vocational path endowed with promising prospects. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty exhibited particular ingenuity, at one juncture compelling the local stamp distributor to relinquish his appointment beneath a tree that subsequently earned renown as the Liberty Tree, apparently demonstrating that even revolutionary movements grasp the importance of effective branding. The Stamp Act Congress, convened in New York in October 1765, witnessed the convocation of delegates from 9 colonies who meticulously drafted a petition addressed to the King and Parliament. This document unequivocally asserted that taxation without representation constituted a direct infringement upon their inherent rights as British subjects. The Congress maintained a remarkably moderate tone in its discourse, essentially articulating, "We remain loyal British subjects, but this entire taxation scheme is proving exceedingly problematic for us." It bore the hallmarks of a profoundly polite letter of separation, save for the crucial detail that the relationship itself had not yet reached its definitive conclusion. The economic boycott of British commodities, which paralleled the political protests, proved surprisingly efficacious, partly attributable to the pivotal role assumed by colonial women in ensuring its success. The Daughters of Liberty meticulously organized spinning bees to produce homespun fabric as a direct substitute for acquiring British textiles. British merchants, witnessing their profits dissipate with the alacrity of complementary provisions at a university gathering, initiated concerted pressure upon Parliament to rescind the Stamp Act. The synergistic confluence of colonial defiance and British mercantile lobbying achieved its intended objective, and Parliament formally repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766, precipitating widespread celebrations throughout the colonies that almost certainly involved a greater consumption of alcoholic beverages than was strictly necessary. Nonetheless, Parliament could not resist the temptation to deliver a final pronouncement, enacting the Declaratory Act on the very same day it rescinded the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act essentially conveyed the message, "We are indeed repealing this particular tax, but merely for clarity, we unequivocally possess the inherent prerogative to levy taxes upon you in any manner we deem fit at any given moment." This was akin to a parental declaration. "Very well, you are not obliged to tidy your room, but I wish for you to understand that I retain the authority to compel you to do so should I desire." The colonists, for the most part, chose to disregard the Declaratory Act, electing instead to revel in their triumph over the Stamp Act. A retrospective decision that was somewhat analogous to celebrating a singular battle victory, whilst overlooking the undeniable reality that the broader conflict remained unresolved. The celebratory mood proved ephemeral, for in 1767, Parliament resolved to implement an alternative strategy through the Townshend Acts, legislation named after Charles Townshend, who seemingly gleaned no instructive wisdom from the preceding Stamp Act debacle. The Townshend Acts imposed duties on a range of imported commodities, such as glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. Essentially, these encompassed all goods that the colonists required, but were incapable of producing in sufficient quantities domestically. The underlying rationale posited that these were external taxes on trade rather than internal imposts akin to the Stamp Act, and therefore, the colonists would presumably find them more palatable. The Townshend Acts additionally established a board of customs commissioners situated in Boston, tasked with the enforcement of these novel duties. The customs commissioners garnered precisely the level of popularity one might anticipate, particularly given their authorization to employ writs of assistance, broad general search warrants that empowered them to inspect any edifice for contraband goods. The scope of these writs was so expansive that they rendered contemporary privacy advocates appear as though they were merely overreacting to minor inconveniences. The colonial response to the Townshend Acts adhered to a familiar paradigm: formal petitions, organized boycotts, and increasingly imaginative manifestations of civil disobedience. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania legal professional who evidently possessed an abundance of leisure time, authored a series of influential essays entitled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. These letters meticulously articulated arguments against the Townshend Acts in language accessible even to non-legal scholars. Dickinson's correspondence was extensively reprinted and served to solidify colonial opposition to the new fiscal measures, thereby demonstrating that occasionally the written word indeed possesses greater potency than the sword, although swords would, in due course, assume significant relevance. The campaign to boycott British commodities proved even more far-reaching than the resistance observed during the Stamp Act crisis. This widespread abstention was rigorously upheld through a blend of societal pressure and more direct, assertive measures. Merchants found to be in contravention of these collective agreements faced the ignominy of having their names publicly denounced in newspapers as enemies of liberty, or they might endure compelling visits from groups of deeply concerned citizens whose appeals to patriotic duty were often remarkably persuasive. Concurrently, in the bustling city of Boston, the simmering animosity between colonial inhabitants and British officials surged to an explosive pitch, making even the most volatile pressure cooker appear remarkably stable by comparison. The customs commissioners, whose presence was universally regarded with the same enthusiasm as a malodorous skunk at an elegant garden party, formally requested military protection. This plea culminated in the deployment of British troops to Boston in October 1768. The spectacle of crimson-coated soldiers parading through Boston's thoroughfares served as an potent emblem of perceived British oppression. Furthermore, the situation was exacerbated by the fact that these soldiers were billeted in public edifices and private residences, as the British government, it seemed, humorously believed the optimal strategy for mending fractured relations with the colonists involved compelling them to accommodate unwanted military personnel. The continuous presence of British armed forces in Boston fostered a volatile environment, a veritable powder keg characterized by persistent daily friction between the troops and the civilian populace. These soldiers, receiving meager remuneration, frequently sought part-time employment to augment their incomes, inadvertently entering into economic rivalry with local laborers for available work. This economic competition, coupled with inherent cultural disparities and the pervasive resentment stemming from the military occupation, cultivated an atmosphere where even the most trivial incident possessed the potential to ignite into something far more substantial. It was akin to confining a multitude of highly stressed individuals within a cramped space, and then expressing bewilderment when discord inevitably erupted amongst them. What subsequently entered historical annals as the Boston Massacre, though labeling it a massacre was perhaps a slight overstatement, akin to describing a minor vehicle collision as a full-blown demolition derby, originated from a seemingly innocuous altercation between a British sentinel and a colonial wig-maker's apprentice concerning an outstanding financial obligation. It appears that even moments of profound revolutionary significance can trace their genesis to prosaic disputes over monetary matters. The confrontation rapidly intensified as an increasing number of colonists congregated, unleashing a barrage of snowballs, ice, and vitriolic taunts upon the increasingly unnerved British soldiers. When a voice from the agitated throng cried out, "Fire!" a phrase that could have been either a provocative challenge or an actual command, the soldiers discharged their weapons, resulting in the tragic deaths of 5 colonists and injuries to several others. The repercussions of the Boston Massacre swiftly transformed it into an exceptionally potent instrument of propaganda for the more radical colonial factions. Paul Revere's celebrated engraving, while possessing an accuracy comparable to a contemporary political advertisement, proved extraordinarily effective in molding and manipulating public sentiment. The stark visual depicted impeccably disciplined British soldiers firing in a synchronized volley at ostensibly peaceful colonial citizens, a stark divergence from the chaotic and spontaneous confrontation that had actually transpired. This incident stood as an early, compelling illustration of how the strategic control of a narrative could often supersede the mere presentation of factual events. John Adams, driven by an unwavering conviction in the fundamental principle that every individual merited legal representation, regardless of their unpopularity, undertook the defense of the British soldiers. His legal advocacy was ultimately successful. The majority of the soldiers were acquitted of all charges, while 2 were convicted on the lesser charge of manslaughter rather than murder. Adams would later reflect that his defense of the British soldiers constituted one of the most vital services he ever rendered to his nascent nation, for it unequivocally demonstrated the colonists' steadfast adherence to the rule of law, even when such adherence proved profoundly inconvenient. Paradoxically, the Boston Massacre had the unanticipated consequence of temporarily de-escalating tensions, as both contending parties momentarily recoiled from the precipice of further conflict. The British government, acknowledging that the Townshend Acts were generating far more strife than any discernible benefit, proceeded to repeal the majority of them in April 1770. However, they deliberately retained the tax on tea, preserving it as a symbolic assertion of Parliament's inherent right to levy taxes upon the colonies. This maneuver was akin to meticulously extracting most of the thorns from a rose bush, yet pointedly leaving one particularly formidable one intact, solely to underscore a principle. Subsequently, relations between Great Britain and its American colonies entered a phase that historians have termed the Quiet Period, though this tranquility was deceptive, much like the stillness of a volcano between its powerful eruptions. The widespread colonial boycotts largely dissipated following the repeal of the bulk of the Townshend Acts. Transatlantic trade subsequently resumed, fostering a widespread hope among many individuals on both sides of the ocean that the profound crisis had finally abated. Nevertheless, Samuel Adams, who could be characterized as the colonial archetype of that unyielding friend, who perpetually refuses to let bygones be bygones, diligently labored to sustain the fervor of resistance. He achieved this through the establishment of committees of correspondence, vital communication networks that facilitated ongoing dialogue among radical groups situated in various colonies. These committees functioned much like an 18th-century social media platform, with the crucial distinction that instead of disseminating amusing cat videos, their primary purpose was to share and amplify grievances against British policy. This fragile period of calm concluded abruptly in 1773 with the enactment of the Tea Act, which represented Parliament's concerted effort to bolster the financially beleaguered East India Company by granting it an exclusive monopoly over tea sales within the American colonies. The Tea Act did not, in fact, impose any new increase on the existing tea tax. Quite the opposite, it would have actually made tea more affordable for colonial consumers. However, its implementation would have effectively driven colonial tea merchants out of business by empowering the East India Company to sell its product directly to retailers, thereby circumventing the established traditional merchant networks. It was a commercial strategy reminiscent of a colossal modern retailer deciding to eliminate all intermediary distributors, though in this historical context, it carried a significantly higher potential for armed insurrection. Crucially, the Tea Act reignited all the long-standing contentions surrounding the contentious issue of taxation without representation, simply because the tax on tea remained in full force. Colonial radicals vehemently contended that acquiescing to the ostensibly cheaper tea would be tantamount to tacitly accepting the fundamental principle of parliamentary taxation, irrespective of any immediate positive financial implications. This became a profound struggle of principle over mere practicality, a dynamic that frequently serves as the catalyst for the most dramatic and transformative historical occurrences. The colonial response to the Tea Act was both immediate and remarkably inventive. In several prominent port cities, colonists successfully obstructed the unloading of East India Company tea, compelling the ships to embark on the arduous return voyage to Britain with their full cargo intact. In Charleston, the tea was indeed unloaded, but subsequently sequestered in warehouses, where it was left to spoil and rot, arguably constituting the most passive-aggressive act of protest recorded in colonial history. Yet it was in Boston where the most spectacular and defiant response unfolded, partly attributable to Boston's peculiar aptitude for transforming political disagreements into elaborate theatrical spectacles. The Boston Tea Party, an event etched into American history, occurring on December 16, 1773, stands as one of the most renowned acts of civil disobedience in the nation's narrative, and notably, one of the most financially costly. Upon the arrival of 3 ships laden with East India Company tea in Boston Harbor, the Sons of Liberty issued an unequivocal demand that the vessels depart without discharging their cargo, while the ship's captains expressed their willingness to comply. The royal governor steadfastly refused to grant them the necessary clearance to depart, precipitating a tense standoff that persisted for several weeks. Ultimately, a contingent of colonists, some cleverly disguised as Mohawk Indians, a choice that was either a shrewd tactical misdirection or, viewed through a modern lens, a rather insensitive act of cultural appropriation, stealthily boarded the ships and proceeded to jettison 342 chests of tea into the frigid waters of Boston Harbor. Remarkably, the Boston Tea Party exhibited an extraordinary degree of discipline for what was, at its core, an extensive act of deliberate vandalism. The participants meticulously ensured the replacement of a padlock that had been inadvertently broken during the operation, conscientiously swept the ship's decks clean, and even returned a small quantity of tea that had accidentally spilled into one participant's shoe. They presented themselves as arguably the most courteous vandals in recorded history, thereby demonstrating that even acts of revolutionary defiance could be executed with a surprising adherence to proper decorum. The British government's reaction to the audacious Boston Tea Party was both swift and unsparing, manifesting in the passage of a series of punitive laws in 1774, which the colonists collectively branded as the Intolerable Acts, although the British government favored the more ostensibly neutral designation of coercive acts. These intolerable acts encompassed the Boston Port Act, which summarily closed Boston Harbor until full restitution was made for the destroyed tea; the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively abrogated the colony's charter and subjected it to direct royal governance; The Administration of Justice Act, which controversially permitted royal officials accused of criminal offenses to be tried in England rather than within colonial judicial systems, and a revised Quartering Act, which significantly expanded the obligation for colonists to provide lodging for British soldiers. The Intolerable Acts were strategically conceived to isolate Massachusetts and to present Boston as a cautionary example to the other colonies. However, their actual impact proved entirely counterproductive. Rather than coercing the other colonies into submission through intimidation, these draconian measures instead convinced a growing number of colonists that British policy had devolved into outright tyranny, and that Massachusetts's struggle was, in essence, a shared fight for all. It was a scenario analogous to a schoolyard bully targeting a single student, only to inadvertently galvanize the entire student body into a unified opposition. Adding further kindling to the already raging flames of colonial discontent, the Quebec Act, enacted concurrently with the Intolerable Acts, extended Quebec's territorial boundaries southward to the Ohio River and formally guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics within Quebec. While the Quebec Act was not technically categorized as one of the coercive acts, numerous colonists perceived it as yet another manifestation of British tyrannical overreach, particularly Protestant colonists who viewed the official protection of Catholicism as a direct threat to their cherished religious liberties. The fact that the Quebec Act also effectively precluded westward expansion by American colonists further intensified its unpopularity, for it seemed that few things provoked greater colonial ire than being explicitly denied the opportunity to move west and claim additional tracts of land. Move west and take more land. The egregious, intolerable acts provoked a significant response. The convocation of the First Continental Congress, which assembled in the venerable city of Philadelphia during September of 1774. Delegates from 12 of the colonies dutifully attended. Georgia, however, conspicuously abstained from participation, perhaps calculating that prudence outweighed valor, or perhaps merely arriving fashionably late to the burgeoning revolutionary festivities. This Congress constituted an extraordinary confluence of burgeoning colonial leadership, featuring individuals who would ascend to future presidencies, occupy seats on the Supreme Court, and notably, at least one figure destined to meet his end in a duel with Alexander Hamilton, a dramatic turn of events, the one that prematurely advances our present narrative. The First Continental Congress grappled with the formidable task of formulating a response to the increasingly oppressive British policies, while simultaneously endeavoring to preserve some semblance of hope for an eventual reconciliation. At this juncture, the delegates remained unprepared to unequivocally declare their independence. Indeed, the vast majority still regarded themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, merely seeking a just redress of their accumulated grievances. Their predicament mirrored that of a couple perpetually embroiled in the same contentious dispute, yet not quite ready to sever their relational bonds. The Congress ultimately adopted a comprehensive declaration of rights and grievances, meticulously articulating colonial objections to British imperial policy. And, of greater consequence, they collectively endorsed an extensive and rigorously organized embargo against British commodities, famously christened the Continental Association. The Continental Association surpassed its predecessors in both its scope and its meticulous organizational framework, establishing local committees meticulously throughout the colonies to rigorously enforce compliance. These formidable committees wielded considerable authority, empowered to meticulously scrutinize merchants' inventories, publicly disclose the names of any transgressors, and generally render existence exceedingly arduous for anyone perceived as unsupportive of the widespread boycott. It functioned akin to a community watch initiative, though instead of vigilantly monitoring for illicit activities like burglaries, their focus was acutely trained on individuals purchasing prescribed British tea. Furthermore, the Congress stipulated a subsequent gathering in May of 1775 should their grievances remain unaddressed, effectively presenting the British government with a clear ultimatum accompanied by a precise temporal constraint. Regrettably for all parties concerned, the British government demonstrated an abysmal aptitude for interpreting such ultimatums, paralleling their profound misunderstanding of colonial psychological dynamics, that is to say, an utter lack of comprehension. Concurrently with the Continental Congress's deliberations in Philadelphia, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which had supplanted the royal government dismantled by the Intolerable Acts, commenced the systematic organization of militia units and the diligent accumulation of weaponry and essential provisions. These critical preparations were spearheaded by influential figures such as John Hancock, who, having amassed a considerable fortune through illicit trade, now skillfully redirected his formidable organizational acumen toward the revolutionary cause, and Samuel Adams, who had at last discovered a cause truly commensurate with his unparalleled talent for political agitation. The British government, acutely recognizing Massachusetts's advanced state of near rebellion, designated General Thomas Gage for the unenviable assignment of upholding British authority within a colony where such authority was as universally disfavored as a governmental tax audit. Gage, in truth, was a man of considerable pragmatism who possessed a more nuanced understanding of the colonial perspective than the majority of his British official counterparts. He had dedicated many years to service in America, and had even cemented his ties to the continent by marrying an American woman. Unfortunately, the virtue of reasonableness proved notably ineffectual when confronted with a situation that had irrevocably transcended the boundaries of rational discourse. By the nascent months of 1775, both opposing factions were assiduously preparing for an inevitable armed confrontation, yet paradoxically harbored lingering hopes of averting it entirely, much like two individuals engaged in a heated dispute who continuously escalate their rhetoric while adamantly insisting they wish to avoid a physical altercation. The colonists were busily forming militia units and stockpiling armaments, while the British were meticulously planning operations designed to seize colonial military caches. This constituted a quintessential security dilemma. Each side's defensive preparations were invariably perceived as offensive maneuvers by the other, thereby fostering a perilous spiral of escalating mistrust and military buildup. The incendiary spark that ignited the American Revolution burst forth on April 19, 1775, when General Gage dispatched a formidable contingent of approximately 700 British soldiers with the explicit objective of confiscating colonial military supplies stored in Concord, Massachusetts. This mission was intended to be executed under the cloak of absolute secrecy, yet within a colony where every resident seemed to be meticulously observing every other. Maintaining the confidentiality of military movements proved as elusive as attempting to keep a surprise party clandestine in a small, interconnected community. The remarkably efficient colonial intelligence network, encompassing a diverse array of informants, from tavern keepers to stable boys, swiftly disseminated intelligence regarding the British advance. Paul Revere and William Dawes were among the notable individuals who gallantly rode to broadcast the alarm. Revere likely did not exclaim, "The British are coming," given that the majority of colonists still identified as British subjects. Revere's legendary nocturnal ride has been immortalized in lore, though it is a historical footnote that he was actually apprehended by a British patrol before reaching Concord, and was subsequently compelled to trek back to Lexington on foot, a detail significantly less dramatic than the poetic rendition suggests. Indeed, historical realities often prove more intricate than the simplified narratives we construct. The British column arrived in Lexington at the break of dawn on April 19th, where they encountered a modest assembly of approximately 70 colonial militiamen arrayed on the village green. This militia, under the command of Captain John Parker, was overwhelmingly outnumbered and harbored no genuine intention of engaging in actual combat with the seasoned British regulars. Their presence was intended as a powerful symbolic gesture of protest, akin to attending a demonstration with a placard, yet without any tangible expectation of effecting substantive change. Parker is famously reported to have exhorted his men with the words, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." While undeniably dramatic, this utterance likely functioned more as a pragmatic admonition to avoid any foolish actions. What transpired next remains one of those perplexing historical junctures where no consensus exists regarding the precise sequence of events, a circumstance profoundly vexing for historians, yet probably characteristic of chaotic situations involving anxious individuals armed with loaded weaponry. Someone discharged a shot, the fabled shot heard round the world. Yet the identity of the shooter, or indeed whether the discharge was intentional, remains shrouded in mystery. It could have emanated from a British soldier, a colonial militiaman, or even an accidental firing. What is definitively known is that following this initial shot, both factions unleashed their fire, and once the acrid smoke had dissipated, 8 colonists lay dead and 10 wounded, while only a single British soldier sustained injuries. The skirmish at Lexington was both brief and decisively one-sided, yet its symbolic resonance was immeasurable. The British column pressed onward to Concord, where they successfully located and destroyed a quantity of military supplies. However, by this critical juncture, colonial militia units were rapidly converging from every corner of the region, thereby transforming what had been conceived as a routine military operation into something far more perilous and unpredictable. The British retreat from Concord back to Boston rapidly devolved into a relentless running battle as colonial militiamen incessantly harried the column from behind the cover of trees, formidable stone walls, and various buildings. The British soldiers, meticulously trained for the formalized open-field engagements characteristic of European-style warfare, found themselves under a ceaseless barrage from an elusive enemy they could scarcely discern. It was an experience akin to navigating a video game where every adversary is a sniper, albeit armed with muskets that required an eternity to reload. The colonial militiamen, many of whom were ordinary farmers and skilled craftsmen with rudimentary military training, demonstrated surprising efficacy in this unconventional style of irregular warfare. Moreover, they were fighting with an intense fervor for their homes and families, which universally serves as an exceptionally potent motivator. The British column might well have been utterly annihilated had it not been for the timely arrival of a relief force dispatched from Boston, which intercepted them at Lexington and provided crucial cover for their arduous retreat. By the conclusion of that fateful day, the British had sustained a staggering 273 casualties compared to a mere 95 for the colonists, an astonishing reversal of expectations for a confrontation between professional soldiers and part-time militia. News of the engagements at Lexington and Concord propagated throughout the colonies with the velocity of a sensational celebrity scandal, conveyed by riders who likely shattered numerous land speed records in their fervent zeal to disseminate the intelligence that armed conflict had, at long last, commenced. This effectively instigated the siege of the British garrison ensconced in Boston. These militiamen converged from across New England, bringing with them their personal weaponry, essential provisions, and a remarkably varied spectrum of military experience, ranging from grizzled veterans of the French and Indian War to teenagers who had never before discharged a weapon in anger. It resembled the most chaotically organized military convention imaginable, save for the critical detail that every participant was armed and profoundly incensed about taxation. The ensuing siege of Boston presented both sides with unforeseen and substantial challenges. The British found themselves effectively incarcerated within a city circumscribed by an adversary they had consistently and dangerously underestimated. Meanwhile, the colonists swiftly realized that the sustained maintenance of an army in the field was an endeavor considerably more intricate than merely orchestrating a protest march. The burgeoning colonial forces suffered from acute deficiencies in virtually every necessity, from critical gunpowder reserves to adequate latrine facilities, and their nascent command structure was as haphazardly organized as an impromptu pickup basketball game. The Continental Congress reconvened a mere 3 weeks subsequent to the events at Lexington and Concord, finding themselves confronted with a dramatically altered situation than they had initially anticipated. Instead of engaging in diplomatic negotiations with the British government from a position of moral authority, they were now compelled to actively manage an ongoing military conflict. It was akin to meticulously planning a peaceful demonstration and inadvertently sparking a full-blown revolution, which, in essence, was precisely what had transpired. The situation had, in essence, reached a critical and undeniable juncture. The New England territories were vehemently pleading for assistance. Yet any assumption of direct responsibility for ongoing military operations would signify a drastic escalation, rendering any hope of reconciliation with Great Britain considerably more remote. Conversely, a decision to abandon the nascent New England forces would, in all likelihood, spell the definitive end of colonial resistance altogether. It was a predicament characterized by a complete absence of favorable options, a scenario where inaction or indecision was arguably the most perilous course of all. The assembled delegates of the Congress ultimately resolved to formally integrate the disparate military units besieging Boston, christening them the Continental Army, a designation that, while lending an air of officialdom, perhaps overstated the actual cohesion or established structure of the forces in those initial stages. A parallel and equally critical task involved the selection of a supreme commander, a process that inevitably triggered a period of intricate political machinations and strategic lobbying. Intuitively, a leader hailing from New England might have appeared the most logical candidate, given that the epicenter of the conflict was situated within those colonies. But the sagacious members of Congress understood the imperative of transforming this regional uprising into a genuinely pan-colonial endeavor, requiring a figure who could unify diverse interests. It was John Adams, demonstrating a profound grasp of political strategy in one of his more astute moments, who put forth the name of George Washington, a prominent Virginian, for the pivotal role. This nomination was strategically motivated, stemming in part from Washington's prior military background and equally from the critical necessity of securing Virginia's robust participation for the viability of the entire revolutionary cause. While Washington's eventual elevation to commander-in-chief might now appear to have been a foregone conclusion, it was, in reality, a rather audacious and uncertain gamble in the context of its own time. Washington possessed a degree of military acumen, honed during his service in the French and Indian War. Yet, his command experience was limited, never having led a force exceeding the size of a regiment. Indeed, his most widely recognized military exploit had been the ignominious surrender of Fort Necessity to French forces. Nevertheless, his imposing stature, dignified bearing, and commanding presence conformed perfectly to the popular conception of a military leader, a seemingly superficial quality that, as events would prove, held far greater significance than initially perceived by his contemporaries. This serves as a potent reminder that the trajectory of historical events can, at times, be profoundly influenced by seemingly trivial or outward appearances. In July 1775, Washington disembarked in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to assume leadership of what was, with considerable optimism, referred to as the Continental Army. In stark reality, it comprised a motley assortment of militia contingents drawn from various colonies, each harboring distinct notions regarding military rigor, hierarchical authority, and even fundamental personal cleanliness. The encampments encircling Boston presented circumstances so deplorable they would undoubtedly appall any contemporary public health official, characterized by woefully insufficient sanitation facilities, rudimentary medical provisions, and a command hierarchy that largely remained in theoretical construct rather than a practical reality. Washington's immediate and most pressing hurdle was not engaging the formidable British forces, but rather the formidable undertaking of transforming this unruly assemblage of armed citizens into a coherent and disciplined military entity. The intricate endeavor of forging a nascent army from disparate elements, all while maintaining an active siege, was further compounded by the prevalent practice of militiamen enlisting for brief periods, often with the expectation of returning to their farms for the crucial harvest season. A stark illustration that even the most profound revolutionary upheavals were, it seemed, constrained by the inexorable rhythms of the agrarian year. Washington was perpetually engaged in managing units whose enlistments were nearing expiration, leading to their imminent departure. He also contended with recalcitrant soldiers who displayed an unwillingness to accept directives from officers originating from different colonial jurisdictions. Furthermore, the nascent army suffered from a persistent and acute scarcity of essential provisions, ranging from vital gunpowder to warm winter apparel. The entire situation bore a striking resemblance to the monumental challenge of orchestrating an outdoor excursion for thousands of individuals who exhibited a complete lack of consensus regarding their desired destination. Concurrently, as Washington wrestled with the formidable exigencies of military leadership, the Continental Congress itself was embroiled in a profound internal debate concerning the ultimate objectives of their burgeoning conflict. A significant faction of delegates still harbored aspirations for a peaceful rapprochement with Britain, exhibiting a marked reluctance to endorse measures that might irrevocably preclude any future compromise. Consequently, in July 1775, the Congress formally endorsed the Olive Branch Petition, a document that represented a final, desperate diplomatic overture designed to avert an irreparable rupture with Great Britain. This petition meticulously affirmed the colonists' enduring loyalty to King George III, while simultaneously imploring him to intercede with Parliament to address and rectify their mounting colonial grievances. The Olive Branch Petition, in its diplomatic intent, bore a striking resemblance to a modern-day digital message sent to a former romantic partner, tentatively proposing a continued platonic relationship. While theoretically plausible, such an endeavor rarely yields the desired outcome. King George III, demonstrating his unequivocal disdain, declined even to formally accept the petition, and subsequently, in August 1775, he dramatically issued a royal proclamation, unequivocally declaring the American colonies to be in a state of open rebellion against the Crown. This decisive action served as Britain's unambiguous rejection of any conciliatory gestures, effectively extinguishing any remaining flicker of realistic hope for a peaceful resolution or a return to amicable relations. Following the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the inaugural substantial engagement of the conflict was the Battle of Bunker Hill, though historical records clarify that the primary fighting actually transpired predominantly on an adjacent elevation known as Breed's Hill, a nuance that illustrates how even the nomenclature of pivotal Revolutionary War confrontations can be deceptively intricate. This significant clash unfolded on June 17, 1775, initiated by British forces in a determined bid to shatter the ongoing siege of Boston by capturing the strategically vital elevated terrain that commanded a view of the urban center. Under the astute leadership of Colonel William Prescott, the colonial contingents had, in the darkness of night, assiduously fortified Breed's Hill, ingeniously constructing formidable earthworks, thereby compelling the British to undertake a grueling uphill assault against well-entrenched and prepared defensive lines. The subsequent British offensive against Breed's Hill would, in retrospect, become a canonical illustration of ill-conceived military strategy for the 18th century. General William Howe, commanding the British assault, made the audacious decision to launch a direct frontal charge up the steep incline in full daylight. His apparent rationale rested on the assumption that the sight of disciplined British regulars advancing in their formidable formations would cause the colonial militia to break and flee in disarray. This particular tactical approach yielded precisely the predictable, disastrous results one might anticipate when assailing an uphill position defended by entrenched adversaries who had, for years, honed their shooting skills, perhaps even on the very agents of British taxation. The intrepid colonial defenders, adhering strictly to the legendary directive to hold their fire until they could see the whites of their eyes, patiently permitted the British forces to advance to an alarmingly close proximity before unleashing a volley of devastating gunfire. The immediate outcome was nothing short of catastrophic for the attackers. The initial British charge was decisively repelled, inflicting severe casualties, a pattern tragically repeated during their second determined attempt. The British ultimately managed to secure their objective on their third relentless assault, but only after the colonial defenders, having exhausted their precious ammunition, were compelled to execute a strategic withdrawal. Although the British could claim a technical victory by seizing the contested high ground, their triumph came at an exorbitant human cost, suffering upwards of 1,000 casualties, a stark contrast to the approximately 400 sustained by the colonists. Such a Pyrrhic victory, if replicated with any frequency, possessed the inherent potential to financially cripple even a formidable global empire. The Battle of Bunker Hill transcended its immediate tactical implications, yielding several profound and far-reaching consequences. Crucially, it unequivocally proved that colonial forces were capable of confronting and holding their own against seasoned British regulars in a direct, sustained engagement. A revelation that delivered an immense surge to colonial morale, while simultaneously inflicting a palpable blow to British self-assurance. Moreover, the engagement starkly illuminated the grim reality that the impending conflict would prove far more arduous and financially draining than any party had initially envisioned. General Howe himself was reputedly heard to lament after the battle that he earnestly hoped never to witness another such victory, and sentiment that is, to say the least, disquieting when uttered by one's supreme military commander. The arduous siege of Boston persisted relentlessly through the harsh winter months spanning 1775 into 1776. Both opposing factions found themselves grappling with the formidable logistical and human challenges inherent in sustaining military operations amidst the unforgiving rigors of a New England winter. While the British forces enjoyed a degree of relative comfort within the confines of Boston, they were, in practical terms, confined as prisoners within the city, largely prevented from venturing beyond their defensive fortifications without incurring the significant peril of an attack. The Continental Army, conversely, endured far less agreeable conditions, encamped in the rural environs surrounding Boston, plagued by insufficient shelter, inadequate clothing, and a chronic dearth of essential provisions. Nevertheless, they commanded the surrounding countryside, a strategic advantage that allowed them to draw vital sustenance and backing from the sympathetic local populace. Paradoxically, Washington's paramount struggle throughout the protracted siege was not against the formidable British Army, but rather the internal fragilities of his own nascent military establishment, as the Continental Army perpetually teetered on the brink of disintegration, a constant threat exacerbated by the regular expiration of enlistment terms and the subsequent departure of soldiers to their homes. Washington dedicated a substantial portion of his demanding schedule to penning urgent missives to the Continental Congress, passionately pleading for vital supplies, desperately needed funds, and the requisite authority to enforce military discipline. His extensive correspondence from this trying epoch vividly portrays the exasperated lamentations of a beleaguered middle manager, striving valiantly to operate an enterprise utterly devoid of financial resources, staffed by unpredictable personnel, and overseen by a governing board incapable of reaching consensus on fundamental operational directives. The pivotal moment in the prolonged siege arrived in early 1776, marked by the extraordinary logistical feat accomplished by Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller who had transformed into a proficient artillery officer, an achievement that stands among the most remarkable of the entire conflict. Knox had embarked on a perilous journey to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, a strategic stronghold that had been famously seized by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in May 1775, and from this remote outpost, he orchestrated the Herculean task of transporting 59 heavy cannons and formidable mortars across more than 300 miles of unforgiving wilderness, all in the dead of winter. The arduous expedition spanned a full 2 months, necessitating the grueling exertion of dragging immense artillery pieces across treacherous frozen rivers, through dense, snow-laden forests, and over formidable mountain passes. This monumental undertaking was, in essence, the 18th century analog to maneuvering a grand piano up a winding staircase, yet infinitely more demanding and complicated by the ever-present imperative of eluding vigilant British patrols. Knox's formidable artillery convoy ultimately reached Cambridge in January 1776, thereby furnishing Washington with the decisive firepower required to render the British occupation of Boston utterly indefensible. In March 1776, Washington masterminded a brilliant clandestine nighttime operation, strategically positioning the newly acquired cannons on Dorchester Heights, an elevated vantage point commanding Boston Harbor, thereby achieving a complete and utter surprise over the British forces. The British garrison awoke to the startling and unwelcome discovery that they were now squarely within the range of formidable artillery pieces that had been conspicuously absent the preceding day, an exceedingly unpleasant commencement to their morning. Confronted with the imminent and dire threat of their naval vessels and defensive fortifications being subjected to a relentless bombardment by American artillery, the British command concluded that Boston was no longer a strategically viable or defensible position. Consequently, General Howe entered into an informal accord with Washington, stipulating that the British would withdraw from Boston without causing its destruction, in exchange for the Americans permitting their unhindered departure. On the auspicious date of March 17, 1776, the British fleet gracefully sailed out of Boston Harbor, conveying approximately 1,000 Loyalist civilians who, facing an uncertain future, chose voluntary exile rather than remaining under the burgeoning American authority. With this monumental exodus, the protracted siege of Boston drew to a definitive close, marking the Americans' inaugural and profoundly significant strategic triumph of the nascent war. The evacuation of Boston represented the nascent American cause's inaugural significant strategic triumph during the conflict. This strategic withdrawal of British forces from Boston constituted an immense propaganda victory for the American revolutionaries, unequivocally demonstrating that the formidable British military could indeed be repelled, and that the burgeoning rebellion transcended the confines of a localized insurrection in Massachusetts. Furthermore, this pivotal success solidified George Washington's burgeoning reputation as a capable military commander, even though his achievements stemmed more from an astute application of patience and meticulous logistical planning, rather than through dazzling, direct battlefield maneuvers. Indeed, history frequently illustrates that some of the most consequential military victories are those distinguished by minimal actual combat, achieved through strategic foresight and persistent pressure. As the siege of Boston neared its definitive conclusion, a confluence of developments elsewhere was inexorably propelling the American colonies towards an absolute severance of ties with Great Britain. In a watershed moment in January 1776, the incisive political theorist Thomas Paine unveiled Common Sense, a groundbreaking pamphlet that ardently championed the cause of American independence, articulated in a vernacular readily comprehensible to the average colonist. Paine's prose was remarkably forthright, imbued with fervent passion, and conspicuously devoid of the conventional diplomatic courtesies that had hitherto characterized the majority of colonial grievances and protests. With audacious candor, he boldly labeled King George III the royal brute, passionately asserting that not only was American independence a tangible possibility, but it was also an inescapable inevitability, a sentiment that resonated profoundly with a populace increasingly disaffected and receptive to such a radical proposition. Common Sense swiftly became an unprecedented publishing phenomenon, achieving immediate bestseller status by distributing more than 100,000 copies within its initial 3 months and ultimately permeating virtually every literate household across the American colonies. Paine possessed an extraordinary aptitude for distilling intricate political philosophies into accessible, potent language that profoundly captivated and galvanized ordinary individuals. He eloquently posited that America possessed the requisite resources and demographic strength to forge an independent nation, that any prospect of reconciliation with Britain was utterly chimerical, and that self-governance was, in essence, America's preordained destiny. His persuasive power was akin to that of a trusted confidant, who, after patient deliberation, finally convinces one to disentangle from a detrimental relationship. Only in this monumental instance, the problematic partner was the colossal British Empire, and the impending separation was to be accompanied by the thundering roar of cannons and the clash of arms. The transformative influence of Common Sense is virtually impossible to overstate. It fundamentally reconfigured the parameters of the prevailing political discourse, shifting the debate from a choice between reconciliation and resistance to one between outright independence and continued subjugation. Prior to Paine's incendiary pamphlet, the vast majority of colonists still perceived themselves as loyal British subjects, merely seeking redress for perceived injustices. However, in the wake of internalizing the arguments presented in Common Sense, a significant multitude began to embrace a new identity as Americans, resolutely pursuing liberation from what they now unequivocally regarded as foreign tyranny. This marked one of those rare, indelible historical junctures where a singular work of literature genuinely altered the trajectory of human events, powerfully affirming the ancient adage that, on occasion, the pen indeed proves mightier than the sword. Though it must be acknowledged, one still requires swords to lend formidable weight to the written word. The Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia during the spring of 1776, found itself navigating an environment of escalating pressure to formally declare independence. The rapidly deteriorating military landscape rendered any prospect of reconciliation increasingly remote. Formidable British forces were meticulously preparing for a massive invasion. Foreign mercenaries were being conscripted to engage in combat against the colonists, and the king himself had officially proclaimed the colonies to be an open rebellion. More critically, the pragmatic exigencies of prosecuting an extensive war necessitated that the colonies operate as a sovereign nation, engaging in diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers to secure vital aid and establishing robust, formal governmental structures. The intricate process of declaring national independence proved far more complex than a mere announcement of America's secession from the British Empire. The Continental Congress was compelled to meticulously weigh the profound legal, diplomatic, and military ramifications inherent in such a momentous and audacious decision. A declaration of independence would ipso facto render the colonists traitors in the unforgiving purview of British law, a transgression punishable by death should their revolutionary gamble ultimately fail. Moreover, it would impose upon them the arduous task of constructing entirely new forms of governance and embarking upon a concerted quest for international recognition and indispensable foreign support. This monumental undertaking was akin to simultaneously deciding to resign from one's employment, relocate to an entirely new metropolis, and embark upon an entirely novel career path, albeit with the chilling, added peril of potential execution should the ambitious venture not yield its desired outcome. The burgeoning movement towards full independence steadily gathered an unstoppable momentum throughout the spring of 1776, as individual colonies commenced the crucial process of formally instructing their respective delegates to endorse a declaration of independence. Virginia emerged as the pioneering leader in May 1776, when its provincial convention explicitly directed its delegates to present a proposal for independence to the Continental Congress. Richard Henry Lee, representing Virginia, subsequently introduced a pivotal resolution on June 7, 1776, unequivocally asserting that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. This seminal resolution functioned as a formal, legally framed proposition for a definitive rupture with Great Britain, meticulously articulated with all the requisite legal terminology and formalistic precision. Concurrently with the ongoing debates surrounding Lee's resolution, the Continental Congress judiciously appointed a select committee tasked with the critical responsibility of drafting a formal Declaration of Independence. This esteemed committee comprised John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, essentially a veritable dream team of colonial intellectuals, though it is highly probable they did not perceive themselves in such grandiose terms at that historical juncture. Jefferson was ultimately chosen to compose the initial draft, partly owing to his widely acknowledged literary prowess, and partly because Adams and Franklin were already heavily engrossed in other pressing committee assignments. It is an intriguing historical footnote that sometimes the most profoundly impactful documents that shape the course of history are penned by the individual who, perhaps coincidentally, possesses the most available time. Jefferson's preliminary draft of the Declaration of Independence stood as an unparalleled masterpiece, seamlessly weaving together profound political philosophy and potent propaganda. It brilliantly synthesized Enlightenment ideals concerning natural rights with a comprehensive enumeration of specific grievances levied against British monarchical rule. The immortal opening phrases, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," articulated foundational principles that would resonate globally, inspiring and shaping democratic movements for centuries to come. This monumental undertaking was akin to crafting the definitive mission statement for the inherent freedom of humanity, an accomplishment by any conceivable measure representing an exceptionally productive day's endeavor. The Declaration proceeded to meticulously catalogue 27 distinct grievances directed squarely at King George III, encompassing a broad spectrum of complaints ranging from the imposition of taxes upon the colonists without their explicit consent to the arbitrary severing of their trade relations with all global markets. This extensive compilation reads like an exhaustive inventory of every perceived affront and vexation the colonists harbored concerning British governance. These complaints varied significantly in gravity, from egregious infringements such as the denial of trial by jury to seemingly more minor annoyances, like the deployment of a multitude of officers designed to harass the populace. In essence, Jefferson was meticulously composing the world's most historically consequential breakup letter elaborating in painstaking detail why the existing relationship was irrevocably broken and why the time had definitively arrived for both parties to seek separate paths. The Continental Congress engaged in rigorous debate and extensive revision of Jefferson's initial draft over several days, introducing modifications that, while personally discomfiting to Jefferson, were likely indispensable for reasons of political expediency. The most salient alteration involved the contentious deletion of a passage condemning slavery and the slave trade, a removal deemed necessary to avert alienating the southern colonies and certain northern merchants who derived substantial profits from the abhorrent institution. The profound irony inherent in proclaiming the equality of all men while simultaneously perpetuating the institution of slavery was a stark contradiction not lost on contemporary observers, and it would cast a long, haunting shadow over American politics for the ensuing century. This historical episode serves as a powerful reminder that even documents intended to spark revolution sometimes necessitate painful compromises with the prevailing political realities. On the auspicious date of July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress formally endorsed Lee's momentous resolution advocating for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, 1776, they officially approved the final, refined version of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, with prescient insight, famously predicted that July 2nd would forever be commemorated as America's Independence Day. However, the annals of history ultimately conferred greater memorability upon July 4th, likely because it marked the approval of the definitive written document rather than merely the conceptual ideal. The ceremonial signing of the Declaration was fraught with intense drama, as each delegate literally pledged their very lives and fortunes, as Benjamin Franklin reputedly quipped, encapsulating the gravity of their collective commitment. "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The Declaration of Independence transcended the confines of a mere political communiqué. It stood as a profound articulation of universal principles destined to inspire and galvanize democratic movements across the globe. The revolutionary proposition that governments derive their legitimate authority from the explicit consent of the governed, and that the populace retains an inherent right to alter or abolish governments that become destructive of their fundamental objectives, was an utterly radical notion in an epoch dominated by the entrenched doctrine of absolute monarchy. It was akin to a resounding public proclamation that the purported divine right of kings was, in actuality, nothing more than a stubbornly persistent myth, a revelation assuredly unsettling to many within the established order. The immediate and transformative impact of the Declaration was its pivotal role in converting the colonial rebellion into a full-fledged war for national independence, replete with all the profound implications such a metamorphosis entailed. The colonists were no longer merely British subjects petitioning for the redress of grievances. They had unequivocally become Americans, valiantly fighting for their inherent freedom against a foreign power. This fundamental shift in perspective proved absolutely crucial for sustaining morale throughout the arduous years of conflict that lay ahead, as it was demonstrably easier to endure immense hardship and sacrifice when battling for the grand ideal of self-determination than when merely voicing complaints about taxation without representation. Moreover, the Declaration carried significant diplomatic ramifications, strategically enabling foreign powers to extend support to the American cause without technically infringing upon Britain's internal affairs. France, which had long harbored a profound desire to diminish British influence ever since its defeat in the 7 Years' War, evinced particular eagerness in championing American independence. The Declaration, in essence, erected a highly visible banner proclaiming "Help Wanted, Enemies of Britain," precisely the kind of astute international relations maneuver that the precarious geopolitical situation urgently demanded. While the esteemed Continental Congress was engaged in the momentous task of formally declaring independence within the hallowed halls of Philadelphia, the prevailing military landscape was rapidly evolving into an increasingly formidable predicament. Though the British forces had previously withdrawn from Boston, they were now meticulously orchestrating a monumental invasion to decisively quell the burgeoning rebellion. General Howe, a formidable military strategist, had skillfully relocated his formidable army to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where his ranks were significantly bolstered by substantial reinforcements arriving from Great Britain and an imposing armada of warships, thereby bestowing upon the British an unassailable advantage in naval supremacy. The strategic objective of the British command was to seize control of New York City, a critical maneuver that would grant them dominion over the vital Hudson River and effectively sever New England's crucial links with the remaining colonies. Recognizing New York as the inevitable subsequent target, General Washington, with his characteristic foresight, prudently redeployed the Continental Army from Boston to New York during the spring of 1776. The formidable undertaking of defending New York presented an immense and multifaceted challenge. The very topography of the city, being largely enveloped by water, rendered it acutely susceptible to assaults from numerous directions, particularly when confronted by an adversary possessing undisputed naval superiority. Washington's nascent army, at this juncture, remained predominantly comprised of temporary militia units, characterized by their limited training and often inadequate equipment. In stark contrast, the British were poised to unleash a contingent of highly disciplined professional soldiers, formidable German mercenaries, and the most potent naval force then known to the world. The situation was akin to the daunting prospect of attempting to safeguard an intricately constructed sandcastle against the overwhelming power of a relentless tsunami, albeit with the added destructive element of numerous cannons. The colossal British invasion fleet that majestically entered New York Harbor in the summer of 1776 represented the largest military expedition Great Britain had ever dispatched to foreign shores. General Howe personally commanded an impressive force of approximately 32,000 seasoned troops, a number that included a significant contingent of 8,000 formidable Hessian mercenaries. This land force was comprehensively supported by an awe-inspiring fleet of over 400 ships, all operating under the astute command of his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. The sheer spectacle of this colossal armada, completely filling the expanse of New York Harbor, must have evoked a complex mixture of profound awe and paralyzing terror among the American observers, much like witnessing the ominous arrival of the Death Star within one's own solar system. In stark contrast, Washington's Continental Army nominally comprised about 19,000 men, though the actual strength of effective combat-ready troops was considerably diminished due to the pervasive scourges of illness, rampant desertion, and the perennial logistical tribulations inherent to 18th-century military operations. A substantial portion of the American soldiery consisted of raw, inexperienced militia, many of whom had never before confronted professional troops in the crucible of battle. Their armaments and provisions varied widely, ranging from barely adequate to utterly non-existent. The glaring disparity in military might was so pronounced that some American officers, guided by pragmatic military acumen, advocated for the complete abandonment of New York without offering any resistance. While this counsel was likely strategically sound, it was deemed politically untenable given the prevailing revolutionary fervor. The devastating Battle of Long Island, which transpired on August 27, 1776, served as Washington's initial significant trial as a military commander, a crucible that very nearly extinguished the nascent American Revolution before it had truly gained momentum. General Howe's meticulously crafted strategy involved disembarking troops on Long Island and launching a multi-pronged assault on the American fortifications, leveraging his numerical superiority and the formidable prowess of his professional soldiers to utterly annihilate Washington's army in a single decisive engagement. The strategic blueprint was inherently sound, its execution was commendably proficient, and the eventual outcome proved to be an unmitigated catastrophe for the American forces. Washington had judiciously positioned his troops upon the commanding vantage point of Brooklyn Heights, which offered a panoramic view overlooking New York Harbor. However, a critical oversight occurred in his failure to adequately secure the Jamaica Pass, a vulnerability that British forces shrewdly exploited to outflank the American positions. The ensuing battle rapidly degenerated into a chaotic rout, with American forces succumbing to widespread panic and fleeing in disarray as the relentless British and Hessian troops advanced from multiple directions. The Continental Army sustained grievous losses, with approximately 1,400 men either killed, wounded, or captured, a stark contrast to the mere 400 casualties incurred by the British. This lopsided defeat was precisely the kind of calamitous setback that typically precipitates the collapse of rebellions. Indeed, it might well have spelled the end of this one, had it not been for the extraordinary events that immediately followed. Washington found himself in an utterly desperate predicament, cornered on Brooklyn Heights with the battered remnants of his army, confronted by the grim prospect of complete annihilation as the British meticulously tightened their encirclement. The gravity of the situation was so profound that capitulation appeared to be the sole rational course of action, an outcome that would have irrevocably spelled the demise of American independence and almost certainly led to the execution of the Continental Congress members as traitors. Instead, Washington demonstrated extraordinary resolve, making one of the most pivotal decisions of the entire war. He resolved to orchestrate the clandestine evacuation of his entire army across the East River to Manhattan under the protective cloak of darkness. The evacuation of Brooklyn stands as one of those truly extraordinary military operations that defies conventional expectations, succeeding against seemingly insurmountable odds. Washington was faced with the monumental task of transporting approximately 9,000 men, along with their essential equipment and vital provisions, across a mile of treacherous water in a fleet of small boats, all while meticulously evading detection by the formidable British fleet. The success of this perilous operation hinged upon impeccable timing, absolute silence, and a considerable measure of good fortune with the capricious weather. Providentially for the Americans, a dense fog miraculously descended just as dawn began to break, effectively obscuring the final critical stages of the evacuation from the watchful eyes of British observers, who were undoubtedly left pondering the mysterious disappearance of their elusive adversaries. While the triumphant evacuation of Brooklyn unequivocally spared the Continental Army from utter destruction, it did not, however, resolve Washington's overarching strategic dilemmas. The British still maintained absolute control over New York Harbor. They continued to possess overwhelming military superiority, and Washington's army remained largely composed of green, inexperienced troops who had just endured a crushing defeat in their inaugural major engagement. The evacuation, in essence, was akin to successfully escaping a raging inferno. While undeniably preferable to the alternative, it left one in a state of utter destitution and without a secure haven. Washington's strategic retreat from New York persisted throughout the autumn of 1776 as relentless British forces relentlessly pursued the Continental Army across Manhattan, through the rugged terrain of the Bronx, and deep into the heart of New Jersey. The American army was in a state of constant motion, engaging in sporadic skirmishes, but generally eschewing major pitched battles that might precipitate another calamitous defeat akin to Long Island. It was a calculated strategic withdrawal, though to the weary and demoralized soldiers enduring it, the experience likely felt more akin to an ignominious flight. The arduous retreat through New Jersey marked one of the nadirs of the American Revolution, with Washington's army dwindling daily as soldiers succumbed to desertion. Enlistment terms expired, and units simply disintegrated. By December 1776, the Continental Army had been tragically reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective combat troops, and even these remaining few were poorly equipped, profoundly demoralized, and yearning to return to their homes. The British, in the interim, had established their winter quarters across New Jersey, seemingly confident that the rebellion had been effectively crushed. The profound crisis of late 1776 spurred Thomas Paine to compose The Crisis, another seminal pamphlet that played a pivotal role in bolstering American morale during arguably the darkest period of the war. Paine's iconic opening declaration, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman," eloquently encapsulated the desperate nature of the situation while simultaneously issuing a fervent call for all Americans to persevere. It was, in essence, a stirring pep talk delivered to an entire beleaguered nation, arriving precisely at the critical juncture when its message was most desperately needed. Washington, with his keen strategic insight, recognized the imperative need for a decisive victory to reinvigorate morale and avert the complete collapse of the American cause. The inherent problem lay in the fact that his army was far too enfeebled to launch an assault on any major British stronghold, and time was rapidly running out as enlistments were set to expire at the close of December. Washington's audacious solution was to target a smaller, isolated garrison that might prove vulnerable to a surprise attack: the Hessian troops strategically stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The plan to launch an assault on Trenton was audacious to the point of being considered recklessly bold. Washington would be compelled to navigate the treacherous, ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of winter, then march his troops a grueling 9 miles through a raging snowstorm, and finally assault a fortified position defended by professional soldiers, all with an army teetering on the precipice of dissolution. The successful execution of this operation demanded that every single element unfold flawlessly, a precarious gamble upon which one would generally be loath to stake an entire revolution. However, Desperate circumstances necessitate desperate measures, and Washington's predicament was as desperate as any commander could possibly face. The legendary crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night 1776 has become one of the most celebrated and iconic episodes in American history, forever immortalized in Emanuel Lewitz's evocative painting, which dramatically depicts Washington standing heroically in a boat, surrounded by his resolute soldiers. The historical reality was likely far less heroic and considerably more miserable. Soldiers grappling with ice-encrusted oars, horses perilously slipping on frozen riverbanks, and every individual grappling with the profound uncertainty of whether this seemingly insane plan could possibly succeed. The crossing itself consumed far more time than initially anticipated, and by the time Washington's vanguard reached the New Jersey shoreline, they were hours behind schedule, now confronting the daunting prospect of launching their attack in broad daylight rather than under the intended cover of darkness. The audacious attack on Trenton on December 26, 1776, achieved a level of success that far exceeded Washington's most optimistic projections. The Hessian garrison, under the command of Colonel Johann Rall, was caught completely off guard. They had been engaged in Christmas festivities and evidently harbored no expectation that anyone would be audacious enough to launch an attack amidst the fury of a snowstorm. The ensuing battle concluded in less than an hour, with the Americans securing nearly 1,000 prisoners while sustaining only a handful of casualties. It was precisely the kind of dramatic and desperately needed victory that the American cause urgently required. The profound victory at Trenton had far-reaching ramifications that extended well beyond its immediate military impact. It unequivocally demonstrated that the Continental Army still possessed the capacity to fight and, crucially, to win. A revelation that was vital for sustaining morale and preventing widespread desertions. Furthermore, it powerfully illustrated that the British and their allied forces were not, in fact, invincible, an insight that galvanized more Americans to actively embrace the revolutionary cause. Most importantly, this triumph bestowed upon Washington the essential credibility he needed to persuade his weary soldiers to extend their enlistments and continue the arduous fight. Sometimes, a seemingly small victory, strategically achieved at the opportune moment, can prove to be far more significant than a large victory secured at an inopportune time. A triumphant moment at an unfavorable juncture. Following their remarkable triumph at Trenton, General George Washington's forces achieved another resounding success against British troops at Princeton on January 3, 1777. This victory further invigorated American spirits and led to the establishment of winter encampments in Morristown, New Jersey. The Princeton campaign served as a compelling testament to Washington's growth as a military strategist, demonstrating his capacity to learn from previous setbacks and evolve into a more formidable commander. His burgeoning strategic acumen favored avoiding large-scale confrontations, instead opting for swift, targeted assaults on isolated enemy positions. This approach shrewdly leveraged the Continental Army's inherent strengths while prudently mitigating its pronounced vulnerabilities. The period spanning the winter of 1776 to 1777 represented a pivotal shift in the ongoing hostilities. This transformation was not rooted in a fundamental alteration of the immediate military landscape, but rather in a dawning realization by both belligerents that the conflict would be a protracted and arduous struggle, far removed from any prospect of a swift resolution. The British, despite their undeniable military superiority, had conspicuously failed to decisively quash the burgeoning rebellion. Conversely, the American forces had unequivocally demonstrated their resilience, proving their capacity to endure significant military reversals and steadfastly persist in their fight. Nevertheless, they continued to grapple with formidable obstacles, encompassing critical shortages in provisions, insufficient training for their troops, and a pressing need for international recognition. For the year 1777, the British command devised a strategy with the ambitious goal of concluding the war by severing New England from the remaining colonies. This elaborate scheme, meticulously crafted by General John Burgoyne, envisioned a three-pronged offensive designed to converge upon Albany, New York, thereby granting the British strategic control over the vital Hudson River Valley. Burgoyne himself was slated to advance southward from Canada with an impressive contingent of approximately 8,000 soldiers. Simultaneously, General William Howe was expected to move northward from New York City, while a smaller detachment under Colonel Barry St. Leger would push eastward from Lake Ontario. It was an exceedingly ambitious blueprint that appeared strategically sound on paper, yet it critically depended on an almost impossibly precise synchronization between forces operating across hundreds of miles with inherently limited communication capabilities. The inherent flaw in Burgoyne's meticulously planned operation lay in its fundamental assumption of General Howe's full cooperation. However, Howe harbored his own distinct vision for achieving ultimate victory in the war. Rather than advancing northward to provide crucial support to Burgoyne's expedition, Howe made the unilateral decision to launch an attack on Philadelphia. He seemingly harbored the conviction that capturing the nascent American capital would effectively extinguish the rebellion's flame. This momentous decision left Burgoyne to venture into the heart of New York without the indispensable support he had been promised and was relying upon. A situation akin to meticulously planning a grand surprise celebration, only to have a significant portion of the invited guests unexpectedly decide to attend an entirely different gathering. Burgoyne's invasion initially unfolded with considerable promise, marked by his forces' capture of Fort Ticonderoga in July 1777, a stronghold that had long been regarded as a cornerstone of American defenses. The unexpected loss of Ticonderoga triggered widespread consternation and alarm throughout New England, prompting sharp criticism directed at the American commanders who had abandoned the strategic fort without a concerted defense. Nevertheless, Burgoyne's difficulties began almost immediately following this initial, albeit significant success, as his substantial army found itself increasingly mired in the arduous wilderness terrain stretching between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. The American counter-strategy to confront Burgoyne's formidable invasion was initially conceived by General Philip Schuyler and subsequently executed by General Horatio Gates, who assumed command of the Northern Department after Schuyler's replacement. This ingenious strategy eschewed direct, large-scale confrontations, instead focusing on relentlessly harassing Burgoyne's extended supply lines and systematically impeding his arduous advance through the unforgiving wilderness. American forces meticulously felled colossal trees across crucial roadways, strategically demolished bridges, and generally engineered myriad obstacles to render Burgoyne's march as agonizingly difficult as humanly possible. It was a masterclass in guerrilla tactics, resembling the most elaborate and consequential practical joke ever conceived, albeit one with profoundly serious military ramifications. Burgoyne's formidable army which comprised not only seasoned soldiers, but also hundreds of camp followers, an array of heavy artillery pieces, and numerous baggage wagons, was demonstrably ill-equipped for the rigors of wilderness warfare. The colossal force progressed at an agonizingly slow pace through the dense, primeval forests of upstate New York, at times managing to cover an average of merely a single mile per day. Compounding these logistical challenges, Burgoyne had also made the rather questionable choice to transport a substantial quantity of personal belongings, including an assortment of fine wines and the company of his mistress, decisions that likely did little to enhance the Army's overall mobility or efficiency. It was a logistical nightmare, akin to attempting to relocate a small, self-contained city through an impenetrable forest, a feat as impractical in reality as it sounds in theory. The initial significant reversal for Burgoyne's campaign occurred at the Battle of Bennington on August 16, 1777. Here, a detachment of his army, dispatched with the objective of seizing vital American provisions, was instead decisively routed by the New Hampshire militia under the resolute command of General John Stark. Stark is famously reported to have rallied his men before the engagement with the stirring declaration, "We'll beat the enemy or Molly Stark sleeps a mere widow tonight," a statement that was either a testament to his profound confidence or a stark expression of fatalism, depending on one's interpretation. The Americans not only achieved a resounding victory over the combined Hessian and British forces, but also captured an abundance of critically needed supplies and equipment, while Burgoyne suffered the irreplaceable loss of approximately 900 men. Concurrently, the western component of the elaborate British strategy also encountered formidable impediments. Colonel St. Leger's force, which had been tasked with advancing eastward from Lake Ontario, met with tenacious resistance at Fort Stanwix and was ultimately compelled to initiate a full retreat. St. Leger's advance from Lake Ontario was decisively halted at Fort Stanwix by tenacious American forces under the command of Colonel Peter Gansevoort, who unequivocally demonstrated that not all American commanders were predisposed to abandoning their positions at the merest hint of impending trouble. The protracted siege of Fort Stanwix evolved into an intricate and multifaceted affair, involving not only seasoned British regulars and dedicated American Continentals, but also fervent Loyalist militia and various Native American tribes. This complex interplay of forces transformed the Mohawk Valley into a convoluted mosaic of shifting allegiances and dynamic military operations. The successful relief of Fort Stanwix was masterfully orchestrated by Benedict Arnold, who, at this particular juncture of the war, remained one of America's most exceptionally effective and valorous military commanders, having not yet contemplated the morally reprehensible path of treason as a viable career alternative. Arnold employed a sophisticated combination of direct military pressure and astute psychological warfare to persuade St. Leger to abandon the siege, including the strategic dissemination of rumors suggesting the imminent arrival of an overwhelmingly massive American army. St. Leger's subsequent retreat effectively dismantled the western prong of Burgoyne's comprehensive strategy and, crucially, liberated American forces to concentrate their efforts against the primary British advance. By September 1777, General Burgoyne found himself ensnared in an increasingly dire and untenable predicament. His once formidable army was rapidly depleting its essential supplies. His crucial communication lines with Canada were under relentless assault, and American forces were steadily amassing in ever-increasing numbers to oppose his arduous advance. Burgoyne had finally reached the Hudson River in the vicinity of Saratoga, but instead of the anticipated effortless march to Albany, he was confronted by a formidable and well-entrenched American army under General Gates, an army that, remarkably, now surpassed his own force in sheer numerical strength. The momentous battles of Saratoga, fiercely contested on September 19th and October 7th, 1777, undeniably marked the pivotal turning point of the American Revolution. Though this profound significance was likely imperceptible to the embattled soldiers engaged in the brutal fighting, the initial engagement, famously known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, concluded essentially as a costly stalemate, with both sides enduring heavy casualties but neither achieving a decisive strategic advantage. This particular battle was notable for the exceptional performance of American riflemen, whose precision proved devastatingly effective against British officers, and for the audacious, almost ubiquitous tactics of Benedict Arnold, who seemed to be present at every critical juncture throughout the intense fighting. The subsequent engagement, widely recognized as the Battle of Bemis Heights, resulted in a clear and unequivocal American victory, a triumph that effectively sealed Burgoyne's inescapable fate. Arnold, who had been controversially relieved of his command by Gates following a heated dispute concerning tactical approaches, nonetheless participated in the battle without official authorization. He was severely wounded while gallantly leading a daring charge against entrenched British positions. Arnold's unauthorized yet heroic actions were characteristic of his distinctive military style, undeniably effective, but frequently insubordinate, a trait that likely contributed to his later, infamous decision to switch allegiances. Following his decisive defeat at Bemis Heights, Burgoyne found his army completely encircled by American forces, with no viable prospect of relief or escape. His beleaguered army was rapidly running critically low on food and ammunition. Instances of desertion were alarmingly on the rise, and the American forces were growing stronger by the day as militia units from across New England continually arrived to reinforce their ranks. On October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne was compelled to surrender his entire army of nearly 6,000 men to General Gates in what became historically known as the Convention of Saratoga. The surrender at Saratoga represented the most profoundly significant American victory of the entire war up to that pivotal moment, effectively neutralizing an entire British army and unequivocally demonstrating that American forces possessed the capability to vanquish professional European troops in conventional warfare. This monumental victory exerted an enormous psychological impact, dramatically bolstering American morale while simultaneously delivering a shocking blow to British public opinion. More importantly, it served as the irrefutable evidence that convinced France that the Americans harbored a realistic and tangible prospect of securing their independence, thereby opening the crucial gateway to the foreign alliance that would ultimately prove decisive in the conflict. The French government's momentous decision to formally enter the war was predicated upon a shrewd combination of strategic calculation and a deep-seated historical animosity toward Great Britain. France had long sought an opportune moment to diminish Britain's global power ever since enduring the ignominious loss of the 7 Years' War, and American independence would effectively achieve that strategic objective while simultaneously unlocking lucrative new trading opportunities. The resounding victory at Saratoga furnished French officials with the undeniable proof they required, solidifying their conviction that supporting America represented a worthwhile and judicious investment rather than a fruitless expenditure on a lost cause. The formal Franco-American alliance, officially signed in February 1778, fundamentally transformed the American Revolution from a localized colonial rebellion into a sprawling global conflict. France generously provided not only vital military and naval support, but also crucial diplomatic recognition, an act that actively encouraged other influential European powers to lend their support to the burgeoning American cause. Spain and the Netherlands would eventually join the burgeoning war against Great Britain, thereby compelling the British to disperse their forces to defend their vast global interests, rather than concentrating their overwhelming military might solely on crushing the tenacious American rebellion. On crushing the American rebellion. The global involvement of France in the ongoing conflict drastically reconfigured Great Britain's strategic priorities, compelling its military planners to divert significant resources towards safeguarding vital interests in the sun-drenched Caribbean islands, the strategically crucial fortress of Gibraltar, and the distant, resource-rich territories of India. This expansive new array of defensive commitments meant that the British military machine could no longer dedicate its full, undivided might to quelling the burgeoning insurrection in the North American colonies, thereby granting the beleaguered American forces a much-needed respite. This period of reduced pressure allowed the nascent Continental Army invaluable time and space to regroup, replenish its ranks, and fortify its resolve to persist in the arduous struggle for independence. Concurrently with these monumental diplomatic shifts unfolding on the international stage, General George Washington and his valiant Continental Army found themselves embroiled in one of the most harrowing and profoundly challenging chapters of the entire war. This crucible of suffering took place during the bitter winter months of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, nestled within the rugged terrain of Pennsylvania. The army had been compelled to retreat to these desolate winter quarters following a series of unsuccessful and ultimately futile attempts to prevent the British military from seizing the strategically important city of Philadelphia. Consequently, Valley Forge rapidly transcended its physical location, evolving into an enduring and poignant emblem of American tenacity and an unyielding spirit in the face of what appeared to be insurmountable adversity and despair. The living conditions endured by the soldiers at Valley Forge were nothing short of horrific, even when judged against the notoriously harsh and often brutal military standards prevalent in the 18th century. A chronic and desperate scarcity of provisions meant that the troops frequently went without adequate food, leading to widespread malnutrition and weakness. Furthermore, a severe lack of proper clothing and shelter exposed them mercilessly to the unforgiving elements, with countless men forced to trudge through the biting snow barefoot, their arduous paths visibly marked by crimson trails of blood left by their frost-bitten feet as they carried out their arduous daily duties. Rampant disease, fueled by unsanitary conditions and weakened immune systems, swept through the encampment like wildfire. Supplies of all kinds were virtually non-existent, and the collective morale of the fighting force plummeted to its lowest ebb. In a desperate plea to Congress, Washington himself penned a stark and chilling warning, cautioning that unless immediate and drastic improvements were made to their dire circumstances, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. A dire prophecy that underscored the critical fragility of their situation. The profound suffering endured by the Continental Army at Valley Forge was rendered even more agonizing by the bitter realization that ample food and essential supplies did, in fact, exist within the surrounding region. However, these vital provisions were tragically failing to reach the desperate soldiers due to a complex web of systemic failures. These included severe and crippling deficiencies within the Continental Congress's nascent and deeply flawed financial system, coupled with a catastrophic breakdown in the crucial supply networks. Local farmers, understandably wary of accepting the rapidly depreciating continental currency, which was fast becoming little more than worthless paper, often displayed a marked reluctance to sell their precious produce to the American forces. Instead, they frequently preferred to engage in commerce with the British, who possessed the distinct advantage of paying for goods in stable and universally accepted gold and silver coinage. This perverse economic reality meant that the Continental Army was literally enduring the pangs of starvation amidst an abundance of resources, a cruel paradox that highlighted the profound administrative and logistical challenges plaguing the American cause. Despite the harrowing and almost unbearable hardships that defined the winter at Valley Forge, this period paradoxically emerged as an absolutely pivotal and transformative chapter in the evolution of the Continental Army. It was here that the fledgling military force began its crucial metamorphosis into a genuinely effective and formidable fighting unit. A significant catalyst for this profound change was the arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a seasoned and highly disciplined Prussian officer who generously volunteered his expertise to aid the American cause. Steuben embarked upon an ambitious and rigorous training regimen, meticulously instructing the American troops in the sophisticated European military tactics and the exacting discipline necessary for success on the battlefield. His comprehensive program systematically transformed the Continental Army from a disparate and often disorganized collection of regional militia units into something strikingly akin to a professional military establishment, imparting everything from fundamental drill movements to intricate and advanced battlefield maneuvers. Baron von Steuben's innovative training methodologies were not merely transplanted wholesale, but were shrewdly adapted to align with the unique conditions and the prevailing attitudes of the American soldiers. Recognizing that American conscripts responded differently than their European counterparts, he judiciously placed a strong emphasis on the development of practical combat skills, rather than on purely ceremonial drills. Crucially, he made a point of explaining the underlying rationale and strategic importance behind various military procedures, fostering a deeper understanding and commitment among the troops, rather than simply demanding unquestioning obedience. Furthermore, he consistently treated the soldiers with a level of respect and dignity that was largely uncharacteristic and indeed revolutionary in the hierarchical European armies of the era. Adding to his challenges, Steuben also had to contend with a formidable language barrier, as his command of English was initially quite limited, necessitating communication through dedicated interpreters. The arduous winter encampment at Valley Forge also served as a crucible for significant and far-reaching changes within the Continental Army's command structure and overall organization. General Washington astutely utilized this critical time to meticulously reorganize his leadership hierarchy, promoting deserving and demonstrably effective officers, while judiciously removing some of the politically appointed individuals who had, through their incompetence, proven to be liabilities in previous engagements. Consequently, the army that triumphantly emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, though numerically smaller than the force that had entered those frozen fields, was undeniably superior in its training, more cohesive in its organization, and possessed a far greater sense of unity and purpose than any American military contingent had demonstrated up to that point in the war. The profound transformation of the Continental Army was put to an immediate and stern test when the British command made the strategic decision to evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate their forces in New York. This critical withdrawal was primarily instigated by France's formal entry into the war, a development that rendered the British position in Philadelphia increasingly precarious and vulnerable to potential assaults by formidable French naval forces. The British retreat presented General Washington with an opportune moment to launch an attack on the British column as it laboriously marched across the breadth of New Jersey, an engagement that culminated in the fiercely contested Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778. The Battle of Monmouth is particularly noteworthy for a multitude of reasons, not least among them being the brutally oppressive heat in which it was fought. The scorching temperatures were so extreme that they tragically resulted in more casualties from debilitating heat stroke than from direct enemy fire, a testament to the unforgiving conditions. The engagement also featured one of the most dramatic and intensely charged confrontations between American officers during the entire conflict, as Washington publicly and scathingly rebuked General Charles Lee for inexplicably ordering an unauthorized retreat. Washington's fury was reportedly so incandescent, and his language so uncharacteristically vehement, that eyewitnesses later claimed they had never heard such an outburst from him, either before or after this incident. A vivid anecdote that suggests even the revered father of his country possessed distinct limits to his legendary patience. The battle itself ultimately concluded as an effective stalemate, with both belligerent armies subsequently laying claim to victory, yet neither managing to achieve a truly decisive or overwhelming advantage. Nevertheless, the exemplary performance of the Continental Army at Monmouth provided irrefutable evidence of the profound effectiveness of Steuben's rigorous training program. American troops, now imbued with newfound discipline and skill, confidently stood their ground against seasoned British regulars in open-field combat, executing complex maneuvers under intense enemy fire with remarkable proficiency. Following the engagement, the British diligently continued their strategic withdrawal towards New York, while Washington's army skillfully established defensive positions in the formidable Hudson Highlands, thereby initiating a prolonged and strategic stalemate that would largely define the character of the war in the Northern Theater for the ensuing several years. The consequential entry of France into the American War of Independence also heralded the arrival of the first significant French military expedition to North American shores, when Admiral d'Estaing's formidable fleet of warships appeared off the American coast in July 1778. The sudden presence of French naval power promised to decisively challenge Great Britain's hitherto unchallenged dominion over the seas, an advantage that had been a cornerstone of British military strategy throughout the conflict. However, the inaugural joint Franco-American operation, an ambitious attempt to capture the British garrison strategically located at Newport, Rhode Island, regrettably ended in complete and utter failure. This unfortunate outcome was largely attributable to a lamentable lack of effective coordination between the newly allied forces and Admiral d'Estaing's ultimately fateful decision to abruptly abandon the entire operation when a British fleet unexpectedly materialized on the horizon. The ignominious failure at Newport starkly underscored one of the persistent and inherent challenges woven into the fabric of the nascent Franco-American alliance. The two allied nations, despite their common enemy, harbored distinctly different strategic priorities and were heirs to fundamentally divergent military cultures, factors which frequently rendered effective cooperation a difficult and often frustrating endeavor. The French, for their part, were primarily motivated by a desire to strategically weaken their perennial rival, Great Britain, and to safeguard their own expansive colonial interests. The Americans, conversely, remained singularly focused on the paramount objective of securing their complete and unequivocal independence. These inherent disparities in fundamental objectives inevitably generated tensions throughout the duration of the alliance, although, crucially, these differences never escalated to a degree severe enough to irrevocably fracture the crucial partnership. Following the events of 1778, the war in the Northern Theater gradually settled into a prolonged pattern of strategic stalemate. Both sides maintained strong, well-fortified positions, yet neither possessed the requisite strength or strategic leverage to achieve a decisive breakthrough or a conclusive victory. The British firmly controlled New York City and its vital harbor, providing them with an indispensable and secure base of operations. Conversely, the Americans exerted control over the vast majority of the surrounding countryside, enabling them to consistently threaten British supply lines and logistical operations. General Washington's overarching strategy during this protracted period was essentially one of calculated attrition, meticulously designed to avoid large-scale, decisive battles while simultaneously ensuring the continued existence and operational viability of the Continental Army. This approach, though often frustrating for more aggressive officers and impatient politicians who clamored for more decisive action, was arguably the only realistic and prudent option given the relative strengths and weaknesses of the opposing forces. Washington possessed a profound understanding that as long as the Continental Army remained an intact and viable fighting force, the British could never credibly claim to have achieved a definitive victory in the war, irrespective of their control over major urban centers or their successes in individual skirmishes. By 1778, the geographical focus of the war began to perceptibly shift towards the southern colonies, as the British government, having reassessed its strategic options, concluded that the South offered more promising prospects for achieving ultimate victory than the stalemated Northern Theater. This newly formulated Southern strategy was predicated on the fundamental assumption that a significantly larger proportion of Loyalist sympathizers resided in the Southern colonies, who would presumably rally to the British standard and provide crucial support to their forces. Furthermore, it was believed that the South's predominantly plantation-based economy would prove more vulnerable to disruption and exploitation by British military operations than the more diversified and resilient economy of the northern colonies. The British Southern Campaign commenced with the swift and relatively effortless capture of Savannah, Georgia, in December 1778. This initial success was achieved by a comparatively small British force, operating under the astute command of Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. The ease with which Savannah fell significantly bolstered the confidence of British officials, leading them to believe that their new Southern strategy was indeed sound and viable. Consequently, they began to meticulously plan more ambitious and expansive operations aimed at systematically dismantling American resistance throughout the entire southern region. The American response to this burgeoning British Southern offensive was unfortunately hampered by the very same persistent and debilitating problems that had plagued the Continental Army throughout the entirety of the war. These included chronic shortages of essential supplies, the pervasive issue of inadequate training among its troops, and the debilitating effects of incessant political interference in crucial military operations. Furthermore, the Southern theater presented its own unique and formidable set of challenges. These encompassed a more geographically dispersed population, the inherent difficulties posed by the region's often rugged and unfamiliar terrain, and a complex, often volatile admixture of regular troops, local militia units, and irregular partisan forces operating on both sides of the conflict. The protracted siege of Charleston, South Carolina, which commenced in March 1780, ultimately culminated in what would become the largest and most devastating British victory of the entire war. In May 1780, General Benjamin Lincoln was compelled to surrender the city and his entire army, numbering approximately 5,000 men, to the overwhelming forces commanded by General Henry Clinton. The catastrophic loss of Charleston dealt a crippling blow to the American cause in the South, effectively eliminating the largest American army in the region and, crucially, granting the British undisputed control over South Carolina's most strategically important port. The resounding British success at Charleston was swiftly followed by a series of additional military victories that seemed to unequivocally validate the wisdom and efficacy of their Southern strategy. Lord Cornwallis, who assumed command of British forces in the South after Clinton's return to New York, inflicted another crushing defeat upon an American army at Camden, South Carolina, in August 1780. This decisive victory effectively eradicated any semblance of organized American resistance within the state. The triumph at Camden was particularly noteworthy for the lamentable and indeed shameful performance of the American militia, who, upon the commencement of hostilities, fled the battlefield almost immediately, abandoning their Continental Army counterparts to be overwhelmed and ultimately annihilated by the numerically superior and more disciplined British forces. Engulfed by the overwhelming might of the formidable British forces, the American troops often found themselves in retreat during conventional engagements. The numerical superiority and seasoned professionalism of the Crown's army frequently dictated the outcomes of these direct confrontations, placing American resolve under immense pressure. Nevertheless, the seemingly assured British dominance in traditional battles was significantly undermined by the emergence of a savage and relentless guerrilla conflict, rendering their hold over the southern territories precarious at best. Audacious partisan commanders, such as the legendary Francis Marion, the indomitable Thomas Sumter, and the astute Andrew Pickens, masterminded irregular military units. These groups launched incessant assaults on British logistical networks, isolated garrisons, and loyalist militias. The elusive nature of these partisan bands made them exceedingly difficult to suppress, as they seamlessly reintegrated into the civilian populace and possessed an unparalleled, intimate knowledge of the local topography and hidden pathways. The unfolding guerrilla warfare in the Southern theater was marked by an extraordinary degree of brutality, far surpassing the ferocity observed in the Northern campaigns. Both sides were implicated in grievous atrocities against captured combatants and non-combatant civilians alike. The conflict rapidly devolved into a veritable civil war, pitting neighbors against one another and fracturing families along deep political fault lines. creating an enduring legacy of bitterness and division. A pivotal turning point in this arduous Southern campaign materialized with the arrival of Nathaniel Greene in December 1780, assuming command of the American forces in the region. Greene, long regarded as one of General Washington's most trusted and capable lieutenants, introduced an innovative strategic paradigm that artfully fused conventional military operations with the disruptive efficacy of guerrilla tactics. Eschewing direct, pitched battles against the formidable British, Greene instead embraced a shrewd strategy of calculated retreat, coupled with relentless harassment of British supply routes and isolated strongholds. Greene's overarching strategic philosophy was famously encapsulated in his enduring declaration: "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." This resilient approach was meticulously engineered to systematically deplete British manpower and resources through unceasing skirmishes and psychological pressure, all while meticulously avoiding the kind of catastrophic, decisive defeat that had previously decimated American armies in the South, threatening to extinguish the flame of independence. The profound effectiveness of Greene's ingenious strategy was vividly showcased at the Battle of Copens on January 17, 1781. There, General Daniel Morgan orchestrated a brilliant tactical masterpiece, leading an American contingent to a resounding victory over Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's much-feared British Legion. Morgan's meticulously conceived plan capitalized on the well-known propensity of militia units to retreat, ingeniously integrating their withdrawal into a sophisticated tactical maneuver that ensnared the British into a devastating trap. This engagement stands as a quintessential illustration of how a numerically inferior force, through superior strategic acumen and exceptional leadership, can decisively overcome a more powerful adversary. The morale-boosting triumph at Cowpens heralded a succession of engagements that steadily eroded British military strength throughout the South. Greene subsequently confronted Lord Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, although technically a tactical defeat for the Americans. The battle inflicted such staggeringly heavy casualties upon the British that Cornwallis was compelled to abandon his campaign in North Carolina. Cornwallis himself reportedly lamented after the brutal encounter that another such victory would ruin the army, a stark testament to the Pyrrhic nature of his success. Cornwallis's consequential decision to relocate his army to Virginia in the spring of 1781 stemmed from his conviction that the Southern colonies could never be truly pacified as long as Virginia continued to funnel vital manpower and essential material to the American cause. This strategic shift to Virginia also reflected Cornwallis's profound exasperation with the pervasive and relentless guerrilla warfare in the Carolinas, where hard-won British battlefield victories consistently failed to translate into effective political control over the vast and hostile countryside. The ensuing Virginia campaign brought Cornwallis into direct confrontation with the Marquis de Lafayette, a remarkably young French volunteer who had rapidly ascended to become one of Washington's most trusted and indispensable subordinates. Despite being barely old enough to cast a vote, Lafayette had been dispatched to Virginia with a comparatively small force to counter relentless British raids. He soon found himself embroiled in a tense and intricate cat-and-mouse game with Cornwallis's significantly larger army. Lafayette's judicious strategy was to meticulously avoid direct engagement while ceaselessly harassing British operations, a remarkably sagacious approach, given that his forces were outnumbered by an approximate ratio of 3 to 1. Initially, Cornwallis's operations in Virginia achieved considerable success, with British forces conducting widespread raids across the state and compelling the Virginia government to precipitously flee from Richmond to Charlottesville. These aggressive British incursions severely disrupted American supply lines and starkly exposed the profound vulnerability of Virginia's sprawling plantation economy to sustained military assault. However, Cornwallis soon discovered that establishing enduring territorial control in Virginia proved to be just as formidable a challenge as it had been in the Carolinas. He could indeed secure battlefield victories and occupy key towns, but he remained utterly incapable of imposing lasting political authority over a fiercely recalcitrant populace. The fateful decision that would ultimately seal Cornwallis's doom arrived in the form of orders from General Clinton, instructing him to establish a fortified naval base along the Virginia coast. This base was to be readily supplied and reinforced by the formidable Royal Navy. Cornwallis selected Yorktown, a modest tobacco port situated strategically on the York River, as his chosen operational hub. This choice, at the time, appeared entirely rational. Yorktown boasted an excellent natural harbor, was inherently defensible, and could serve as an ideal springboard for future military endeavors. Tragically for Cornwallis, it would also prove to be an inescapable snare. The extraordinary opportunity to ensnare Cornwallis at Yorktown emerged from a rare and fortuitous confluence of impeccable coordination between American and French forces. General Washington, who had been meticulously planning an assault on New York, received crucial intelligence that a powerful French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, was sailing northward from the Caribbean. This fleet possessed a sufficient number of ships to decisively challenge British naval supremacy in the vital Chesapeake Bay. If de Grasse could effectively command the waters surrounding Yorktown, Cornwallis's army would be completely severed from seaborne reinforcement or evacuation, rendering him acutely vulnerable to a decisive siege. Washington's audacious decision to abandon his New York plans and instead march his forces southward to Virginia stands as one of the most profoundly important strategic choices of the entire war. This epic march demanded absolute precision in timing and flawless coordination between American and French forces, operating across hundreds of miles without the benefit of reliable communication channels. It was akin to meticulously orchestrating a grand surprise party, where half the guests had to traverse an entire continent and arrive at the precise, predetermined moment. Yet the ramifications of failure in this military endeavor were immeasurably more dire than merely a ruined celebration. The arduous march to Yorktown was a logistical tour de force, a testament to the remarkable advancements and increased professionalism of the Continental Army since the conflict's nascent stages. Washington and his esteemed French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, masterfully moved their combined armies over an astonishing 400 miles in less than a single month. They maintained absolute secrecy regarding their ultimate destination until they were too far south for the British to mount an effective interception. This monumental march also necessitated the complex crossing of several major rivers and the intricate synchronization with French naval assets, all while meticulously ensuring the army remained adequately supplied and its morale steadfastly high. The siege of Yorktown commenced on September 28, 1781, as the formidable combined American and French armies, numbering approximately 17,000 men, meticulously encircled Cornwallis's beleaguered force of roughly 8,000 British and German troops. The siege operations adhered to the classical European pattern of gradually encroaching upon enemy fortifications through a meticulously constructed series of parallel trenches. These trenches were expertly protected by an incessant artillery bombardment that progressively rendered the lives of the trapped defenders increasingly unbearable. It was a form of warfare characterized by its slow, deliberate, and highly methodical nature, placing a premium on engineering prowess over individual acts of heroism. The absolute linchpin of the entire siege was Admiral de Grasse's unyielding control of the Chesapeake Bay, which effectively thwarted any attempts by the Royal Navy to either reinforce or evacuate Cornwallis's trapped army. The French fleet had decisively vanquished a British naval force at the pivotal Battle of the Capes on September 5, 1781. In what is recognized as one of the most significant naval engagements in American history, the battle itself was not particularly dramatic, involving extensive maneuvering and comparatively little direct combat. However, its consequences were colossal, for it irrevocably sealed Cornwallis's fate at Yorktown. The siege operations at Yorktown were conducted in strict accordance with the formal conventions of the 18th century warfare, with both opposing sides meticulously observing traditional courtesies, even amidst their concerted efforts to decimate one another. The Allied forces systematically advanced their trenches closer to the British fortifications, expertly shielded by fascines and gabions that provided crucial cover from enemy fire. The labor was undeniably perilous and utterly exhausting, yet it was also remarkably methodical and entirely predictable. Everyone involved understood the established protocols of siege warfare, and this particular siege unfolded precisely according to the standard pattern. The decisive turning point in the siege arrived when the Allied forces successfully captured two crucial British redoubts that anchored the outer defensive line. This strategic seizure allowed them to reposition their artillery close enough to render the British position utterly untenable. The daring assault on these redoubts was spearheaded by the ambitious Alexander Hamilton and the valiant Marquis de Lafayette, affording these two future American political adversaries a moment to share military glory before their inevitable disagreements over fiscal policy. The capture of these vital redoubts was accomplished with remarkably light casualties, a testament to the exceptional effectiveness and precision of the Allied siege operations. Cornwallis's desperate situation became unequivocally hopeless when a much-anticipated relief expedition from New York was severely delayed by adverse weather conditions and lamentable coordination. General Clinton had painstakingly assembled a formidable fleet and army specifically to rescue Cornwallis, yet the expedition tragically did not set sail until October 19, 1781, the very day that Cornwallis formally surrendered at Yorktown. The timing was akin to arriving at a grand celebration just as every other guest was departing, except in this instance, the party was a catastrophic military defeat, and its profound consequences included the effective loss of an entire empire. The formal surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, was executed with all the solemn ceremony and precise adherence to 18th century military protocol demanded by such a momentous occasion. Cornwallis, citing an illness, dispatched his second-in-command to present his sword to General Washington, who, in turn, magnanimously directed him to surrender it to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. The British troops marched out of their fortifications with their regimental colors cased and their bands playing the poignant tune, "The World Turned," upside down. A selection that was either remarkably appropriate for the profound shift in global power, or a serendipitous coincidence that historians have relished interpreting ever since. Historians have continually analyzed this pivotal moment. The complete subjugation of Cornwallis's formidable army at Yorktown constituted the monumental triumph for which the American forces had ceaselessly striven throughout the protracted conflict. The significant depletion of approximately 8,000 seasoned soldiers from British ranks, coupled with the profound, demoralizing effect of such an unequivocal defeat, conclusively extinguished any lingering aspirations Britain harbored for securing victory through purely military avenues. Furthermore, this resounding success unequivocally underscored the formidable efficacy of the Franco-American partnership and strikingly illustrated that conventional European-style siege tactics could indeed be executed with remarkable proficiency on American soil, provided the requisite strategic circumstances were meticulously aligned. When intelligence regarding the Yorktown capitulation arrived in London during November 1781, it reputedly provoked an anguished utterance from Prime Minister Lord North, who famously lamented, "Oh God, it is all over." This poignant exclamation likely mirrored the pervasive dismay among British government officials, many of whom had been anticipating dispatches detailing Cornwallis's triumphant progress in Virginia, rather than the catastrophic news of his utter vanquishment and apprehension. While the momentous victory at Yorktown did not instantaneously conclude the hostilities, it unequivocally signaled to all belligerents that the prevailing British military strategy had irrevocably faltered, thereby making an eventual diplomatically brokered resolution an unavoidable imperative. The interim spanning from the pivotal events at Yorktown to the official cessation of the conflict was distinguished by a progressive de-escalation of military engagements and the nascent stages of intricate peace negotiations. Although British forces retained control over significant strategic strongholds such as New York, Charleston, and Savannah, they conspicuously refrained from initiating any substantive endeavors to recommence offensive maneuvers. Concurrently, the American contingents were content to preserve their military presence in the field, patiently awaiting the outcomes as their diplomatic representatives meticulously crafted the specifics of a comprehensive peace accord. This phase bore a striking resemblance to the concluding moments of a fiercely contested boxing bout, where, despite both combatants remaining upright, the undisputed victor is universally acknowledged. The intricate peace deliberations were rendered exceptionally convoluted by the undeniable reality that the war had metastasized into an expansive global confrontation, drawing in numerous European powers, each pursuing distinct and often divergent objectives. France, for instance, harbored a strategic desire to debilitate its perennial rival, Great Britain, yet simultaneously evinced a cautious reluctance to see the nascent American nation accrue excessive power. Spain, another key player, sought ardently to reclaim Gibraltar and to circumscribe American territorial ambitions extending westward. Britain, for its part, endeavored assiduously to mitigate its substantial losses while simultaneously exploring avenues to potentially fracture the burgeoning alliance between America and its European confederates. The entire diplomatic process thus unfolded akin to a profoundly high-stakes poker tournament, where every participant was intently engaged in discerning the concealed strategic holdings of their adversaries. The American delegation dispatched for peace negotiations, comprised of the astute Benjamin Franklin, the resolute John Adams, and the shrewd John Jay, demonstrated themselves to be exceptionally adroit diplomatic practitioners. They successfully orchestrated the attainment of treaty stipulations that substantially surpassed the most optimistic expectations held by many at the conflict's outset. The preliminary peace agreement, formally endorsed in November 1782, unequivocally acknowledged the burgeoning nation's independence, meticulously defined the Mississippi River as the definitive western demarcation of the United States, and generously conferred upon American citizens invaluable fishing entitlements off the rich shores of Newfoundland. This triumph was akin to experiencing the exhilaration of winning a grand lottery prize, especially after having purchased a ticket whose very legality one might have initially questioned. The seminal Treaty of Paris, formally affixed with signatures on September 3, 1783, definitively concluded the American Revolution and consecrated the United States as a fully sovereign and independent nation. This momentous accord reaffirmed the provisions previously outlined in the preliminary agreement and stipulated the complete withdrawal of British military contingents from American sovereign territory. The signing of this treaty represented the grand culmination of 8 arduous years of warfare, a period that had profoundly transmuted 13 disparate British colonies into a unified and self-governing entity. However, the subsequent and equally monumental undertaking of actually constructing and solidifying that nascent nation would ultimately prove to be nearly as formidable as the struggle to secure its independence itself. The departure of British forces from New York City on November 25, 1783, served as a profoundly symbolic denouement to the American Revolution. General Washington, at the vanguard of his steadfast Continental Army, ceremoniously entered the liberated metropolis, thereby finally realizing the strategic objective that had tantalizingly eluded him since the calamitous campaign of 1776. This significant evacuation transpired without incident, characterized by an orderly procession of British troops embarking onto ships, while American soldiers simultaneously assumed command of the urban landscape. The scene evoked the conclusion of an exceptionally protracted and financially burdensome eviction proceeding, with the notable distinction that, in this historical instance, the departing occupants had vigorously attempted to eliminate their landlords for the better part of 8 years. General Washington's poignant valedictory address to his loyal officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York on December 4, 1783, constituted an intensely emotional occasion, serving to underscore the profound personal allegiances and camaraderie that had been forged amidst the arduous and protracted struggle for independence. Washington's subsequent, deliberate choice to relinquish his military commission and revert to the quietude of private citizenship was perceived as an extraordinary and truly remarkable act by European commentators who were historically accustomed to victorious military leaders leveraging their armed forces to usurp political authority. This voluntary abdication of immense power by Washington thus established an indispensable precedent, one that would prove foundational for the enduring evolution and character of American democracy. The human toll exacted by the American Revolution was demonstrably immense, notwithstanding the inherent challenges in precisely ascertaining definitive casualty statistics due to fragmented historical documentation and the broad inclusion of irregular militia forces, non-combatant civilians, and allied combatants. Historical scholars generally posit that approximately 25,000 Americans perished throughout the duration of the conflict, encompassing both uniformed military personnel and private citizens, from an estimated total population of around 2.5 million. The British forces and their various allies experienced a comparable magnitude of losses, while the financial drain imposed by the war proved utterly staggering for all nations embroiled in the hostilities. This epical struggle was akin to the most exorbitantly priced disputation ever recorded in history, with the crucial distinction that this particular contention revolved around the foundational tenets of governmental structure and the inherent rights of humanity. The societal and financial ramifications stemming from the revolution proved to be no less profound than its political transformations. The protracted conflict fundamentally dislocated established social stratifications, concurrently generating novel avenues for upward social mobility and directly confronting entrenched suppositions concerning authority and inherent distinctions among individuals. The eloquent espousal of equality and natural rights, which had served as the foundational justification for the revolutionary uprising, inevitably brought forth pressing inquiries regarding the institution of slavery, the entitlements of women, and the proper treatment of indigenous Native American populations. While these intricate issues would remain largely unresolved for numerous ensuing decades, the revolution symbolically functioned as the opening of a vast portal to previously unimagined possibilities, even if the actual journey through that threshold was destined to be a protracted one. The far-reaching repercussions of the American Revolution reverberated significantly beyond the geographical confines of the newly constituted United States. This triumphant insurrection against British imperial dominion served as a powerful wellspring of inspiration for burgeoning democratic movements across the European continent and throughout Latin America. While the seminal principles eloquently enshrined within the Declaration of Independence subsequently furnished an archetypal framework for countless other independence struggles. Moreover, the revolution conclusively evinced that subjugated colonial populaces possessed the capacity to successfully defy and overcome formidable European imperial powers, a revelation that would carry immensely profound implications for the trajectory of colonialism on a global scale. The very genesis of the United States likewise engendered substantial geopolitical ramifications, effectively introducing a nascent power onto the North American continent that was destined to progressively contest European hegemony across the entire Western Hemisphere. Seminal historical events, such as the Louisiana Purchase, the subsequent Mexican-American War, and the eventual inexorable expansion towards the Pacific coastline, all found their foundational impetus in the hard-won independence secured during the Revolution. The United States that emerged from the crucible of this transformative conflict, though initially modest in size and comparatively feeble when measured against established European standards, nonetheless harbored an immense, untapped potential for both demographic growth and territorial augmentation. The enduring legacy of the American Revolution persists in profoundly shaping American political thought and cultural identity, even more than 2 centuries following the decisive triumph at Yorktown. The fundamental tenets of limited governmental authority, the safeguarding of individual entitlements, and the paramountcy of popular sovereignty, all firmly established during the Revolutionary era, continue to occupy a central position within contemporary American political discourse, even as their interpretation and practical implementation remain subject to ongoing evolution. Furthermore, The Revolution fostered the creation of a powerful national mythology, one that prominently accentuates themes of unfettered liberty, inherent equality, and steadfast resistance against despotic tyranny. While the historical actuality of the American experience has frequently fallen short of these lofty ideals, the strategic and tactical insights gleaned from the American Revolution became subjects of rigorous examination by military theoreticians and field practitioners for successive generations after the cessation of hostilities. The astute deployment of irregular guerrilla tactics, the indispensable significance of widespread popular endorsement for any sustained military endeavor, and the inherent complexities of prosecuting a war within an inimical geographical setting, all subsequently emerged as critical areas for military scholarly inquiry. The Revolution also compellingly illustrated the paramount importance of cultivating robust international alliances and emphatically demonstrated the pivotal and often decisive influence that naval supremacy could exert in dictating the ultimate resolution of land-based campaigns. Fundamentally, the American Revolution achieved its ultimate success through an unparalleled synthesis of tenacious military resistance, sophisticated political orchestration, astute international diplomatic maneuvering, and unwavering popular backing, creating a strategic confluence that rendered a British victory utterly unattainable. Notwithstanding Great Britain's seemingly insurmountable advantages in both military might and naval dominance, the American colonists proved remarkably capable of sustaining their determined resistance for a sufficiently prolonged duration. This protracted struggle rendered the conflict excessively burdensome financially and increasingly unpopular among the British populace, thereby making its continuation untenable for the Crown. Concurrently, the colonists successfully cultivated and secured crucial foreign assistance, which ultimately provided the indispensable leverage for achieving a decisive victory. Their triumph was analogous to prevailing in a grueling marathon by sheer endurance and resilience, rather than through superior speed, with the added intensity that this particular marathon spanned 8 years and was punctuated by the thunderous roar of artillery. The profound metamorphosis of the American colonies, transitioning from their former status as British subjects to that of self-governing, independent citizens, represented not merely a political realignment, but also a fundamental psychological transformation that engendered an entirely novel consciousness of national identity. The collective ordeal of the Revolution, replete with its attendant hardships, profound sacrifices, and eventual glorious triumph, played an instrumental role in forging a cohesive American identity, one that effectively transcended pre-existing regional distinctions and cultural divergences. The Revolution, therefore, did not solely give birth to a new political entity, but also cultivated a distinct populace, individuals who henceforth perceived themselves unequivocally as Americans, rather than merely as European émigrés transplanted to a new continent. The economic repercussions stemming from the Revolution presented a complex tableau, characterized by an amalgamation of both unforeseen opportunities and formidable challenges inherent in the newly acquired independence. The nascent nation gained the liberty to engage in commerce with any global entity, unencumbered by the restrictive mercantile policies of the British Empire. However, this newfound freedom also entailed the forfeiture of the protective umbrella afforded by British commercial and formidable naval power. Furthermore, the protracted conflict had amassed colossal debts, a financial burden that would persistently afflict American public finances for many ensuing decades. While the fundamental disruption of established trade paradigms inevitably fostered a period of economic instability, the attainment of independence bore a striking resemblance to a divorce from an affluent yet domineering marital partner. Unequivocally liberating in spirit, yet undeniably intricate and demanding in its financial ramifications. The revolutionary endeavor, while undoubtedly exhilarating in its grand aspirations, proved to be an undertaking fraught with financial complexities. The transformative conflict of the American Revolution also ushered in momentous ramifications for indigenous Native American peoples, who soon confronted a nascent nation even more relentlessly pursuing territorial growth towards the West than the former British colonial power. Numerous Native American tribes had strategically aligned with Britain during the protracted conflict, driven by the aspiration that a British triumph would effectively curb the burgeoning American encroachment into their ancestral domains. However, the ultimate American victory tragically signified that these communities now faced an antagonistic administration possessing scant regard for upholding prior treaties or demonstrating due reverence for Native American land tenure. The pervasive and morally contentious issue of chattel slavery, a subject deliberately sidestepped for the most part throughout the revolutionary struggle, despite its glaring paradox with the foundational principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, metamorphosed into a progressively more vexing dilemma in the immediate post-war era. Certain segments of the American populace, predominantly residing in the northern states, perceived the revolution as a propitious opportunity to eradicate this peculiar institution. Conversely, others, particularly those entrenched in the southern states, viewed such aspirations as an existential peril to their agrarian economy and hierarchical societal structure. While the revolution had boldly asserted the fundamental equality of all humanity, it would tragically necessitate a subsequent, devastating conflict to definitively ascertain whether that lofty principle genuinely extended to every individual inhabiting the newly formed American Republic. Beyond securing independence, the American Revolution undeniably laid foundational principles for a republican form of government, setting a course that would profoundly shape the trajectory of political development across the globe. Yet, this monumental upheaval simultaneously engendered a series of formidable challenges that the nascent nation would persistently grapple with. The inherent friction between central federal authority and the sovereign power of individual states, the evolving function of partisan political organizations, the protections afforded to marginalized groups, and the very inherent constraints of popular rule were all intricate issues that were born out of the revolutionary experience, but remained definitively unsettled by its conclusion. In essence, the revolution served as the initial, pivotal chapter in what would become an exceptionally lengthy and complex chronicle detailing the ongoing experiment of democracy and the intricate art of self-governance. The hard-won international recognition of American independence represented a signal diplomatic achievement, effectively establishing the United States as an acknowledged participant within the global community of nations. Nevertheless, this triumph simultaneously ushered in an array of fresh obligations and formidable hurdles for the nascent republic. The newly independent nation was compelled to formulate its unique approach to international affairs, cultivate formal diplomatic ties with other sovereign states, and vigorously safeguard its national prerogatives, now devoid of the protective aegis of the mighty British Empire. While independence conferred upon America the liberty to chart its own course and make autonomous decisions, It unequivocally also mandated that the young nation must henceforth bear the full weight of the repercussions stemming from those choices. Ultimately, the American Revolution transcended the mere objective of severing political ties with Great Britain. Its profound essence lay in the genesis of a novel governmental paradigm, meticulously constructed upon the fundamental principles of popular sovereignty and the unwavering safeguarding of inherent personal liberties. The triumph of this audacious endeavor in self-government would unleash far-reaching ramifications, not solely for the burgeoning American populace, but for countless individuals across the globe who were actively contending with despotic rule and subjugation. The revolution irrefutably demonstrated the viability of popular self-rule by common citizens, a truly revolutionary concept in an epoch overwhelmingly dominated by autocratic sovereigns and inherited aristocratic privilege. Ultimately, the comprehensive narrative of the American Revolution stands as a compelling testament to the transformative potency of ideological conviction in shaping global destiny. The colonial inhabitants initially articulated their grievances against particular imperial directives, yet their trajectory culminated in the forging of an entirely novel sovereign entity, founded upon the enduring tenets of freedom, parity, and popular autonomy, principles destined to galvanize future struggles for popular rule for centuries to come. The entire historical arc of the American Revolution, spanning from the initial protests against British taxation to the definitive establishment of American independence, unfolded as an arduous, intricate, and frequently violent conflict. This monumental struggle transmuted 13 disparate colonial holdings of the British Crown into the United States of America, thereby inaugurating a new nation and a distinctive form of government poised to leave an indelible mark on global historical development. The revolution unequivocally demonstrated the capacity of common individuals to effectively oppose even the preeminent global superpower of their era when they were contending for deeply held convictions, a timeless precept that resonates profoundly in the contemporary era. A truly momentous occurrence is currently unfolding, captivating the attention of many individuals across various spheres. This particular development, taking place at this very moment, holds considerable weight and significance for contemporary discussions and future trajectories. Its immediate impact is already palpable, drawing widespread interest and prompting considerable commentary from observers and analysts alike. Indeed, the unfolding situation represents a pivotal happening on the current global stage, demanding close scrutiny and careful consideration as its implications begin to manifest.